Eliza Whittaker pressed her palm flat against her dead husband's chest and counted to 10. Cold, still, gone. She did it again anyway, fingers spread wide over his worn flannel shirt because she was not ready to stop counting. Because stopping meant starting the rest of her life without him. Because 3 children were asleep in the next room, and when they woke up, she would have to say the words out loud, and once she said them, they could never be unsaid. She counted to 10 one final time. Then she stood up, smoothed her dress, walked to the window, and looked out at the Montana dark, at the nothing stretching in every direction, and she made herself a promise she had no idea how to keep. I will not fall apart, not yet, not until they are safe. She kept that promise for 2 years, and it nearly destroyed her. Before we go any further, if this story is already reaching something inside you, if you've ever felt like the world looked straight through you, like you weren't even standing there, please take just a moment and subscribe to this channel. Hit that bell so you don't miss a single word of what comes next. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. I want to see your name. Now let's go back to Eliza. The morning Eliza Whittaker walked into the Caldwell General Store was the morning she finally ran out of pride. Not because she wanted to. Not because she had decided that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, or that asking for help was something a woman of her particular stubbornness could ever do without swallowing something sharp on the way down. No, she walked through that door. Because Caleb had eaten the last of the cornmeal 3 days before, Rose had cried herself to sleep the night prior, with a belly that had nothing in it but water and a little dried apple, and Lillian, 9 years old, gray-eyed, already ancient behind the face, had quietly slipped her own portion of supper onto her brother's plate and pretended she wasn't hungry. That was the moment Eliza ran out of pride. She pushed through the door of the general store with Rose on her hip and Caleb and Lillian at her heels, and she was already rehearsing what she would say to Thomas Caldwell, already building the words in the back of her throat, like someone laying bricks, careful, deliberate, one at a time, because if she didn't build them carefully, she knew they would fall, and she would fall with them. She never got the chance to use them, because standing at the counter, deep in conversation with Thomas Caldwell and not even bothering to lower her voice, was her cousin Martha. Martha Caldwell, née Whittaker, was 43 years old, soft in the body and iron in the soul, and she had opinions about everything that breathed within a 30-mile radius of Red Willow. She had opinions about the preacher's sermons and the school teacher's posture, and the way the Hennessy boy wore his hat. She distributed these opinions freely and often, and she did it with the particular confidence of a woman who had never once been wrong about anything, at least not in her own accounting. She had opinions about Eliza too. Eliza had been hearing them for 2 years. Thomas, I'm telling you, Martha's voice carried the full length of the store without effort, without apology, the way a church bell carries loud, clear, and completely uninterested in whether you wanted to hear it. She needs to face the truth of her situation. The children are a burden nobody asked for. Richard's been gone 2 years and she's still living like help is coming. Help is not coming. Thomas Caldwell said something low that Eliza couldn't make out. I don't care about sentiment, Martha said. Sentiment doesn't feed 3 children. Sentiment doesn't pay for a roof. She had her chance at a decent life, and she made her choices, and now she's got to live with them. There isn't a man in this county with good sense who's going to walk himself into that situation. A widow is one thing. A widow with 3 children who aren't his, that's something else entirely. That's another man's burden tied up in bows and presented like a gift. Eliza stopped walking. She was 4 feet inside the door, close enough to the shelves of canned goods that she could have reached out and touched them. Rose was a warm, solid weight on her hip, one small hand curled into Eliza's collar. Caleb had gone still beside her the way he always went still, when adults said things he didn't fully understand, but sensed were somehow about him. And Lillian had heard every word. Eliza could tell by the set of her daughter's jaw, by the way the girl's eyes had gone flat and careful and ancient. Martha turned then, the way people turn when they feel a shift in the air, and she saw Eliza standing there. She did not look sorry. She looked, if anything, vindicated. Eliza. She said the name the way you'd say there you are to someone who'd been avoiding an obvious truth. I didn't hear you come in. I know you didn't, Eliza said. Her voice was steady. She had not known it would be steady. She had thought it might crack or go thin, the way voices do when the body is betraying the mind, but it was steady, and she held on to that steadiness the way you hold on to a fence post in high wind. I need to speak with Thomas about credit, she said. For flour and cornmeal and some dried beans. Martha's expression shifted not to sympathy, not to anything that looked like mercy, to something that Eliza recognized after a moment as a kind of sad, certain patience. The expression of a person who has said something true that the other person hasn't accepted yet. Eliza, softer now. Almost. Credit isn't going to solve what you're facing. I'm not asking you what it'll solve, Eliza said. I'm asking Thomas for it. Thomas Caldwell was a big man with a small heart, or maybe it was a big heart that had been beaten small over the years. Eliza had never been sure which. He looked between the two women, with the expression of a man who would very much like to be somewhere else entirely. I've already extended considerable credit to the Whitaker account, he said. I'm not sure I know what I owe you, Eliza said. And I know I'm asking for more on top of it. I'm asking anyway. I have 3 children who need to eat. Silence. Martha made a small sound, soft and pitying and devastating. This is exactly what I mean, she said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. Eliza, listen to me. You are a young woman still. 36 isn't finished, but you are going to lose everything trying to carry what you cannot carry alone. The children, she stopped. Looked at Lillian, looked at Caleb, looked at Rose on Eliza's hip. Something crossed her face that might have been actual feeling. The children would be better placed, somewhere. They can be cared for. The orphanage in Billings is run by decent women, good Christian women. The children would be fed and schooled and... Eliza's voice wasn't loud. But it stopped Martha the way a rifle shot stops a room. Rose stirred against her shoulder. Caleb pressed closer to her side. Lillian did not move at all. You finish that sentence, Eliza said quietly, and I walk out that door and I never speak to you again. Not in this life. Martha closed her mouth. Thomas, Eliza turned back to the counter. Flour. Dried beans. Whatever you can manage against what I still owe. I'll make good on it before spring. Thomas Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and began filling an order. It was not as much as she needed. It was more than she had. She thanked him without warmth, took the package, and walked her children back out into the January air. She did not cry until she was halfway home. She cried walking, which was something she had never done before in her life, had never understood how a person could do it, had always thought you sat down somewhere private to do your crying, but she understood it now. Because stopping meant the children would see her stop, would know she had stopped for this, and she could not afford for them to know how close to broken she actually was. So she walked and she cried, and the cold air dried it off her face almost as fast as it fell, and by the time they got back to the homestead she was steady again. Steady and hollow and very, very tired. That night, after the children were down, Lillian in her cot reading by the last inch of a candle, Caleb already asleep with his knees pulled up, Rose tucked against her rag doll with the kind of totality that only small children achieve in sleep. Eliza sat at the kitchen table and looked at the letter. She had taken it out of the tin box where she kept the important papers. The tin box that had Richard's death certificate in it, and the deed to the land that was now hers to keep or lose, and a letter from her own mother written the year she married Richard that said, "You have chosen well, my girl." He is a good man, in her mother's careful slanted hand. The letter she was looking at now was not from her mother. She had found it 3 weeks ago in a copy of the Helena Independent that had made its way out to Red Willow, folded inside a saddlebag belonging to a man passing through. She hadn't been looking for it. She had been reading the news from Helena, or trying to, squinting at the small print in the light of a dying fire, and there it was, tucked between an advertisement for a patent tooth remedy and a notice about land auctions. Seeking a partner in life and work. I own a cattle ranch outside Red Willow, Montana 400 acres, decent water, sound buildings, one man alone who has no interest in staying that way. I am 38 years of age, honest in my dealings and not given to cruelty. I am not looking for someone to manage my house. I am looking for a family to share my life with. Children are not obstacles. They are part of the person you choose when you choose them. If you are a woman of good character who has known difficulty and kept your honor through it, I'd be glad to hear from you. Write to W. Holloway, care of the Red Willow Post. She had read it 6 times before she'd let herself put it down. She had read it the way you read something that sounds too much like what you needed to hear, with suspicion first, then with something more dangerous than suspicion. She had read it looking for the catch, looking for the place where the words meant something different than they appeared to mean. Looking for the telltale sign of a man who wanted cheap labor dressed up in matrimonial language, or a man who'd decided children sounded fine in theory until they were actually underfoot and crying and needing things at inconvenient hours. She hadn't found it, which scared her more than if she had. She had written back. It had taken her 4 drafts and 2 days to write 4 paragraphs. She had been honest in a way that felt almost violent, brutal, really, the way honest things sometimes are when you've spent a long time softening them for other people's comfort. She told him she was 36. She told him she had 3 children, their names and ages, their particular individual natures as best she could describe them in a letter. She told him her husband had died of fever 18 months after what had seemed like a minor illness. She told him she was not asking for charity, and that she had no intention of arriving anywhere as a burden, but that she also was not going to apologize for what she was bringing with her. Because what she was bringing with her was her children, and they were not things she intended to diminish or minimize for the sake of making herself a more palatable prospect. She had sent it before she could change her mind. The response came back in less than 2 weeks, which was fast for postal delivery between rural Montana points, and suggested either luck or intention, or both. Mrs. Whitaker, I appreciate a woman who writes plainly. I have been around enough to know the difference between plainness and roughness, and there is none of the latter in your letter. 3 children does not change my thinking. If anything, what you've described tells me more about you than a dozen letters from women who have had easier lives. A woman who keeps her children fed and her family together, after the kind of loss you've described, is not a woman I'd describe as a burden. She is a woman I would describe as exactly what I said I was looking for. I would like very much to meet you, if you are willing. I will cover the cost of travel for you and the children. There is no obligation beyond the visit. If you come and decide the situation is not what you need, I will see you safely back to wherever you wish to go. I only ask that you come with an open mind. Respectfully, W. Holloway. She had read that letter 9 times. She had cried after the 4th reading and refused to examine why. Now she sat at the kitchen table in the January cold, the letter flat under her palms, and she had a decision to make. She had written to 8 men over the past 6 months. 8. She had not done it easily, and she had not done it without considerable private mortification, because Eliza Whitaker had been raised to believe that a woman of good character did not advertise herself in newspapers like a piece of livestock. And it had taken her a long time to arrive at the point where the alternative watching her children go to sleep hurry, whilst pride sat fat and satisfied and useless on the shelf, was clearly end. Obviously worse than the humiliation of the thing. She had written to 8 men. 4 had not written back at all. 2 had written back, asked how old the children were, and then stopped writing. 1 had written 3 letters that became progressively more peculiar in ways she could not quite name but felt instinctively, the way animals feel weather before it arrives. And the 8th had written back to say, with an air of generosity that made her skin crawl, that he was a flexible man and would be willing to consider taking on a woman with children, provided the children were old enough to be useful, and provided she understood that a wife's first obligation was to her husband's household and not to children from a previous marriage. She had not written back to that one. She had burned the letter and felt better for it. And then there was W. Holloway, Wyatt Holloway. She had learned his Christian name from the postmaster in Red Willow, who knew everyone's business and was not shy about sharing it. Wyatt Holloway, 38 years old, owned a spread about 12 miles east of town. Been there going on 10 years, quiet man, decent reputation. Wife, no family local. Kept to himself, but not in a way that suggested something was wrong, more in the way of a man who was simply busy in private and had not yet found a reason to be otherwise. He could still change his mind, she told herself. He could see the children and change his mind. He could see me and change his mind. He could see all of it and decide the letter sounded better than the reality. She believed that very sincerely. She also believed, with the other part of her mind, the part she usually kept quieter, that she was running out of options, and that a man who wrote the way Wyatt Holloway wrote was at the very least worth a train ride. She folded the letter back into its envelope. She did not sleep much that night. In the morning she told Lillian first, because Lillian was the one who would take it hardest and the one whose reaction would most shape the younger children's understanding of it. She sat her daughter down at the kitchen table, while the other two were still asleep, and she put the letters in front of her, and she told her the truth. All of it, not a softened version, not a children's version. The actual truth, because Lillian at 9 was already a person who could smell softening from 3 rooms away and did not forgive it. Lillian read both letters. She read them slowly, the way she read everything, with total absorption, one finger moving slightly across the words. She had been reading since she was 5. Richard had taught her, sitting with her at this same table with the same candle, his big hand guiding her small one, patient in the way he was patient about everything, which was to say completely. When she finished, she looked up at Eliza. He could be lying, she said. He could be, Eliza agreed. Most adults are about the important things. Eliza did not argue with that, because she could not in good conscience argue with a statement whose evidence was abundant and personal and real. He might not be, she said instead. Lillian looked at the letters again. At Wyatt Holloway's words about children not being obstacles. At she is a woman I would describe as exactly what I said I was looking for. How will we know, she asked. We'll watch, Eliza said. We'll watch very carefully and we'll know. Lillian considered this. All right, she said finally, but if he's cruel, we leave. If he's cruel, Eliza said, we leave the same day. Lillian nodded, picked up the letters and handed them back to her mother with a gravity that belonged on someone 30 years older. And then she got up and started the morning fire, because there was a baby sister and a little brother asleep in the next room, and they would be hungry when they woke up, and the kindling wasn't going to light itself. Eliza watched her daughter move around the kitchen, with that particular ache she had gotten used to living, with the ache of watching a child grow up too fast. Of knowing that the growing was happening in response to necessity, and not choice, and not being able to stop it. She folded the letters into the tin box. She began packing 3 days later. She did not tell Martha. She did not tell anyone in Red Willow except Thomas Caldwell, to whom she explained that she was settling her credit by way of the ranch, proceeds from the sale of Richard's equipment, what little there was, and that she would be departing by week's end. Thomas received this information with a mix of what seemed like genuine relief and something that might have been guilt, though she did not examine the guilt part closely because she had no room left for other people's feelings at the moment. She packed their clothing, their books, the tin box with the important papers, and Rose's cloth doll, which Rose would not have survived the journey without. She packed the photograph of Richard that lived on the mantelpiece, because the children needed to be able to look at their father's face, and because she needed to be able to look at it too. And because taking it meant she was not trying to race him, only to move past the place where losing him had left her standing. The morning they left, the temperature was 9 degrees. The children were quiet on the way to the station. Even Rose, who was ordinarily not quiet, who had opinions about everything and expressed them in a steady, relentless commentary that Eliza had once found exhausting and now found essential, even Rose was quiet. Sitting between Lillian and Caleb in the wagon with her doll pressed to her chest and her eyes wide and watching. Caleb had cried a little in the night. Eliza had heard him through the wall and gone in and sat with him until he settled. "What if the horses don't like me?" he'd said, because this was what he was most afraid of, and Eliza loved him fiercely for the smallness of it. "If this man has horses," she'd told him, "and he seems like a man who does, I think the horses will think you're the finest thing they've ever seen." Caleb had considered this seriously. "You think?" "I genuinely think." He'd gone back to sleep. At the station, Eliza bought 4 tickets and helped her children onto the train with their bundle of belongings and sat them in a row on the wooden seat and watched Red Willow, Montana slide away through the window. And she did not feel relief, and she did not feel hope, and she did not feel sorrow. She felt, mostly, determination. The particular grim-faced, jaw-set determination of a woman who has tried everything except this, and is going to try this now. The train took 2 days. Rose got sick on the first day, not from illness but from the motion, and Caleb talked the entire time about horses he had known, horses he had seen, horses he had read about. Horses that were theoretical and possibly mythological, and Lillian sat with her face turned to the window and her hands folded in her lap and did not say very much at all. Eliza watched the Montana landscape go past and tried not to think about Wyatt Holloway changing his mind. On the morning of the second day, Lillian turned from the window and looked at her mother. "Mama," she said. "Whatever happens," Eliza said, "we're together." Lillian nodded. Caleb said, "Do you think he has a black horse?" "I hope he has a black horse." "Black horses are the best ones." Rose said nothing. But she moved closer to Eliza on the seat, and Eliza put her arm around her, and they rode the last 2 hours together, like that, huddled into themselves, 4 people braced against whatever was coming. The station at Red Willow came into view through the window. Eliza straightened her spine. She smoothed Rose's hair with one hand. She breathed. The train slowed, stopped. She stood up, took Rose onto her hip, reached down for the suitcase, and she walked to the door of the car. The platform was cold and bright. She stepped off the train. And there was a man. He was taller than she'd expected, though she hadn't let herself expect much, because expectation was a door she'd closed very firmly 2 years ago. He wore a dark hat and a coat that had seen weather, and he was standing at a slight distance from the platform, not crowding in the way some men crowd, and when she stepped off the train, he took off his hat. He took it off, not just touched the brim, took it clean off and held it against his chest, the way you take off a hat in church or in the presence of something that deserves the full gesture. He looked at her, not at her clothes, which were the best she had and were not very fine. Not at the children behind her, not with the calculating look she had been preparing herself for, the look that totaled up the children as quantities, as costs. He just looked at her, directly, the way people look at each other when they are actually trying to see. Then he said, "Mrs. Whitaker, welcome home." She had not expected that word. Home. It hit her somewhere she had not expected to be hit. She was not crying. She refused to be crying. But something in her chest moved, shifted, settled differently than it had been sitting for 2 years, and she felt it move the way you feel a bone go back into place, uncomfortable, sudden. And then the beginning of something that is not quite relief, but is adjacent to it. "Mr. Holloway," she said. He said, "Please." "Wyatt." She heard her own voice saying it. "Thank you for meeting us." He was looking at her children then, not with calculation. With what she could only describe, in the privacy of her own mind, as actual interest, the kind of interest that is not performed, that is not being done for an audience. He crouched down. He crouched all the way down, which meant he was at eye level with Caleb, who was staring at him with enormous eyes. "Caleb," Wyatt said. He said it like he already knew the name, like he had been thinking it. "Your mama tells me you know about horses." Caleb's mouth opened slightly. "I know a considerable amount about horses," he said, with the dignity of a 6-year-old who has been waiting his entire life for someone to acknowledge this. "Good," Wyatt said. "I've got 5 of them and I could use a knowledgeable opinion." He stood up and looked at Lillian. Lillian looked back at him. This was a test. Eliza knew it was a test because she knew her daughter, knew that Lillian was measuring him the way you measure ice before you put your weight on it, checking for cracks. "Lillian," he said, Your mama mentioned you like to read. I like to read most things, Lillian said carefully. Some things more than others. I've got some books at the house, he said. Don't know if they're the right kind of things. You're welcome to look through them and tell me which ones are worth keeping. Something flickered in Lillian's eyes. All right, she said. Last he looked at Rose. Rose had her face buried in Eliza's shoulder. He did not try to engage her, did not make the mistake of pressing himself on a child who was not ready for him. He simply looked at her for a moment, gentle and patient, and then he looked back at Eliza. Ready? He said. She thought about what she was walking toward. She thought about the 12 miles between this station and a ranch she had never seen, belonging to a man she had met in a life she could not fully picture. She thought about Martha Caldwell's voice in the general store, carrying the full length of the room without effort. There isn't a man in this county with good sense who's going to walk himself into that situation. Yes, she said, and she walked with him toward the wagon. She noticed as she walked that he had positioned himself so that she was between him and the wind. She did not comment on it, but she noticed. The drive to the ranch took nearly 2 hours. Wyatt drove and let the children talk, let Caleb ask the 17 consecutive questions he had been storing up about the horses, and answered each one with patience and specificity. Let Lillian sit in her studied silence without trying to draw her out. Rose stayed close to Eliza and watched Wyatt from under her eyelashes with the particular surveillance of a very small, very serious child who has learned that watching is safer than trusting. When they finally pulled into the yard, the sun was going low and painting the snow in colors that were almost embarrassing in their extravagance, orange and pink and a thin line of something nearly purple along the mountains, and the ranch. The ranch was not what Eliza had expected. She had braced herself for something bleak. Something that would make the situation's difficulty visible in the physical fact of the place. She had expected the house of a man alone, which in her experience meant practical and unadorned, and slightly sad in the way that things are sad when nobody has thought to make them otherwise. The house was plain, yes, there was no question about its plainness. But it was solid, with good windows and a porch that had been recently repaired, and a barn beyond it that showed clear signs of careful keeping. And on the porch rail a row of 3 small things. She saw them when she got down from the wagon. Wyatt offered his hand to help her down, which she took, and as she steadied herself, she saw the 3 objects on the rail. A carved wooden horse, small and detailed, its mane caught mid-toss. A cloth-covered book small enough for a child's hands. And a little wooden chair, low and just the right size for a 3-year-old, with a small cushion tied to the seat. She looked at them. Then she looked at Wyatt. He was helping Caleb down from the wagon and not looking at her, and so she could look at him without him seeing her look at him, which was the only way she could do it right then, because she did not know what her face was doing. Wyatt, she said. He looked over. She gestured at the rail. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has done, and is not entirely sure how it will be received, not with pride exactly, but with a kind of careful, steady attention. Figured they might want something that was theirs, he said. Didn't know if I had it right. Caleb saw the horse. The sound he made was not words. He pushed past his mother and past Wyatt and went straight up the porch steps and picked up the wooden horse with both hands and held it up to examine it with the intensity of an appraiser, turning it, looking at its legs and its mane and its carefully carved face. He made it, Lillian said. She had come up beside Eliza without Eliza noticing. Her voice was flat, careful, the voice she used when something had surprised her, but she wasn't ready to admit it. He made it, Eliza confirmed. They stood together, mother and daughter, and watched Caleb hold the wooden horse, like it was the most important thing he had ever been given. Rose was looking at the small chair. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Wyatt. Wyatt was watching her, without expression, without pressure, giving her exactly the space she needed to make whatever decision she was going to make. Rose crossed the porch. She climbed up into the small chair. She sat down. She settled Rose's doll in her lap, and she looked out at the yard with the expression of a small queen surveying her domain. Eliza pressed her lips together very hard. Behind her, she heard Lillian exhale a small control downson that was the most Lillian would allow herself in the direction of emotion. Wyatt said quietly, so only Eliza could hear, "The books are inside." For Lillian, "I wasn't sure if I should put them out here." Eliza turned and looked at him. He was looking at her with the same direct attention he'd used at the station. Steady, honest, nothing hidden in it that she could detect, and she had spent 2 years learning to detect the things people hid. "What made you think of it?" she asked. "The children." "The things for them. You'd never met them." He was quiet for a moment. "Because they were coming," he said, "and they'd need to know there was room for them." Eliza looked at her children, Rose in her small chair, Caleb with his horse, Lillian standing at Eliza's shoulder very still, her jaw set, and her eyes bright with something she would absolutely deny if asked. She thought about the night she had pressed her palm against Richard's chest and counted to 10. She thought about 2 years of making do and holding on, and not falling apart by main force of will. She thought about Martha Caldwell's voice in the general store, carrying full length of the room, the words delivered with the brisk certainty of someone stating simple fact. There isn't a man in this county with good sense who's going to walk himself into that situation. "It's a good thing you did," Eliza said. Wyatt put his hat back on. "Come on inside," he said. "It's cold." She followed him in. The children followed her, and the door closed behind them on the January cold, on the mountains going dark beyond the windows, on everything they had left and everything they had not yet found. The ranch was quiet, and for the first time in 2 years, the quiet felt like something that might become bearable. The first night was the hardest, not because anything went wrong. That was the strange part, nothing went wrong, and that was precisely what made it so difficult. Eliza had spent 2 years bracing for the next thing that would go wrong, had built her entire internal architecture around the anticipation of disaster. And now she was sitting at a man's kitchen table, eating a meal he had prepared himself while her children ate beside her, and nothing was going wrong, and she did not know what to do with that. Wyatt had made a beef stew. Simple, competent, clearly not the first time he had done it. He put the pot on the table and filled the children's bowls first without being asked to, and Rose, who had not eaten a full meal in 3 days because of the train sickness, ate with the single-minded focus of a very small person who has decided something is good and intends to confirm that decision completely. Caleb ate with one hand and kept the wooden horse in the other, setting it against the side of his bowl. Lillian watched Wyatt. She did it openly, which was Lillian's way. She did not pretend not to be doing things she was doing. She ate her stew and she watched Wyatt with her gray, assessing eyes, and Wyatt did not appear to mind being watched, which Eliza noted. Men who had things to hide did not sit comfortably under that kind of scrutiny. They deflected it, or challenged it, or made the watcher feel somehow rude for looking. Wyatt passed the bread and answered Caleb's questions about the horses and did not perform at all, which was the most disarming thing he could have done. After supper, he showed them where they would sleep. 3 rooms. Eliza had known this from his letter, but standing in the hallway and seeing it made it real in a way that the letter had not quite managed. 3 rooms prepared, clean, with quilts on the beds and enough space to be actual rooms and not afterthoughts. Caleb's room had the wooden horse's kin all along the windowsill, not the carved one, which was already in Caleb's fist, but a series of drawings pinned to the wall beside the window, horses in various postures. Clearly done by someone who had looked at real horses and tried to get them right. Caleb stopped in the doorway and stared. "Did you draw those?" he asked. "When I was about your age," Wyatt said. "Figured a boy who knows about horses ought to have them on his wall." Caleb walked to the wall and stood very close to one of the drawings, examining it with the seriousness of a man examining a legal document. "This one has the proportions wrong," he said. "The legs are too long for the body." "I know," Wyatt said without a trace of offense. "I was 6. "I could show you the right way," Caleb offered generously. "I'd appreciate that," Wyatt said. Rose's room had the small chair from the porch sitting beside the window, and on the bed a quilt in yellow and white that was clearly newer than everything else in the house. and Rose walked to it and pressed her palm flat against it and looked at Eliza. Eliza looked back at her. Rose picked up her doll, set it on the pillow, and then turned and held her arms up to be carried. She did not speak. But she settled in Eliza's arms with a completeness that meant something. And Eliza held her and breathed the smell of her daughter's hair, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the holding didn't already say better. Lillian's room had the books. He had set them on a shelf beside the bed, a proper shelf, newly mounted if the unfaded wood around the brackets was any indication. There were 12 books. Lillian walked directly to the shelf and ran her finger along the spines and read the titles in a murmur, and Eliza watched from the doorway while Wyatt stood beside her. And Lillian pulled one out and turned it over and read the back and put it back and pulled out another. "This one," Lillian said finally, holding it up. "This one is good." "What makes it good?" Wyatt asked. Lillian looked at him. It was the first time she had looked directly at him since they'd arrived. "You'd have to read it to understand," she said. "But if you want to know if I'm right, you're welcome to borrow it when I'm done." Something in Wyatt's expression shifted, not a smile exactly, but the thing that comes before a smile, the internal adjustment that a smile is the outward result of. "Fair enough," he said. He showed Eliza the room she would take, which was across the hall from the children, and he told her the house was hers to use as she needed, that there was no part of it that was off limits to her or the children. That the only thing he asked was that if something broke, she told him rather than trying to fix it herself. Because some of the things in this house had particular ways of breaking that required knowing about them first. "Like what?" she asked. "The back door sticks in the cold. You have to lift and then push. If you push without lifting, you'll spend an hour getting it open, and you'll be angry when you finally do." She almost smiled. "I appreciate the warning." He nodded. Went to the door of his room, which was at the end of the hall. Stopped. "Mrs. Whitaker." "Eliza," she said, because he'd said Wyatt at the station and it seemed only correct. "Eliza," he said it quietly, careful with the vowels. "I know this is strange. I know it doesn't feel like anything you planned. And I know you came here with your eyes open because that's the kind of woman, I can tell you, are from your letters. So I want to say plainly that there's no expectation on my side that anything happens before you're ready for it. This is your home now. Take the time you need." She looked at him. 2 years of widowhood had made her a student of men's words, of the gap between what men said and what they meant. She had gotten good at measuring that gap. She could not find one here. "Good night, Wyatt," she said. "Good night," he said, and closed his door. She stood in the hallway alone for a moment. Then she went to check on the children, who were already asleep, all 3 of them. Caleb with the wooden horse still in his hand, Rose curled around her doll on the yellow quilt, Lillian with the book open on her chest and her eyes closed and her hair spread on the pillow, looking for one unguarded moment like the child she actually was. Eliza turned down Lillian's lamp. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed, and she let herself feel, privately and briefly and with the door closed, the terrible, complicated weight of the day, the fear and the strangeness, and the thing she would not yet name. The thing that had moved in her chest at the word home on that train platform, the thing she didn't have language for yet, because she had not allowed herself to have language for it. She sat with it for 10 minutes, then she lay down. And for the first time in 2 years, she slept through the night without waking. The first week moved like something she'd never experienced before, which was to say it moved slowly in the moment, and then, when she looked back at it, seemed to have gone very fast. The ranch had its rhythms, and the rhythms were demanding, and demanding rhythms were something she understood deeply. Wyatt was up before dawn every morning. She could hear him not loudly. He was a quiet man in his movements, but the house communicated sound in ways that old houses always did, creaking and settling and transmitting the fact of people in it. She heard him in the kitchen, heard the stove being started, heard the back door lifted and pushed, as he'd described, and then the sound of him crossing the yard to the barn. By the time she had the children dressed and breakfast started, he was back. He ate quickly, talked enough to be present without being intrusive, answered Caleb's daily onslaught of questions, and then went back out to work. He did not expect her to follow a particular schedule. He did not instruct her on how to manage the house. He simply did his work and let her find her footing. She found her footing faster than she expected. The house was not difficult to learn. The kitchen was well organized in the way that kitchens organized by people who actually cook are organized not for appearance but for efficiency. Everything within reach of where you'd need it. The logic clear once she looked for it. The pantry had more in it than she'd had at the Red Willow homestead in the last 6 months combined. And she stood in the doorway of it the first morning and felt something that was embarrassingly close to the feeling she imagined a person might feel walking into a church after a long absence, a kind of stunned, slightly undone gratitude that she would have been mortified for anyone to witness. The children settled faster than she'd expected, too. Caleb was in the barn within 24 hours. Not because anyone put him there, but because the barn was where the horses were, and Caleb had a constitutional inability to be in close proximity to horses without immediately positioning himself as close to them as possible. Wyatt had apparently decided that this was not something to be managed or redirected, because on the second morning when Eliza went looking for her son and found him in the barn, standing on the lowest rail of a stall, talking quietly to a bay mare who was listening with evident interest, Wyatt was working nearby, and did not appear to think this required intervention. "Is it all right?" Eliza asked. "He's got away with her," Wyatt said without looking up from what he was doing. "She doesn't let most people that close. He's always been like that with animals." "Some people are." He glanced over at Caleb, who was now explaining something to the mare with considerable intensity. "It's a gift." Eliza watched her son. 6 years old, talking to a horse like it was the most natural conversation in the world, and the horse's ears were forward and attentive, and something in the scene was so purely and simply good that it was almost painful to look at directly. She looked away. Rose was slower. Rose did not go to Wyatt. Rose watched him, constantly and from a distance, with the focused attention of a very small person conducting a very serious study. She watched him at meals, watched him from the porch when he worked in the yard, watched him through the window from her small chair. But she did not approach him, and he did not approach her, and the space between them remained respectful and intact. Eliza noticed that he never tried to close it. Some men in that situation would have tried. Would have pushed in the direction of the child, brought her things, spoken directly to her, made the discomfort of the space visible by attempting to fill it. Wyatt simply went about his business and let Rose observe, and made no indication that he found the observing anything other than normal. She thought about that a lot in those first days. She thought about a man who understood that trust was not a thing you could manufacture by wanting it hard enough. Then came the morning of the 6th day, which was when Lillian finally broke. Not fell apart. Lillian did not fall apart. Lillian broke the way certain very controlled, very precise pieces of machinery break, completely and without warning and with a violence that is entirely disproportionate to whatever small thing finally pushed past the tolerance limit. The small thing was a book. Specifically, it was Lillian going to the shelf for the book she had been reading, and finding it wasn't there, and then finding it on the kitchen table, and seeing that it was open to a page she hadn't read yet, and understanding in the same instant that someone had moved it. "Who touched my book?" she said. She said it the way her mother said things when she was very, very calm, which meant she was not calm at all. Caleb looked up from his breakfast with enormous eyes. "Not me. Who touched my book?" Lillian said again, louder. "Lillian." Eliza's voice was a warning. "Someone moved it." Lillian held it up, pointing at the open page. "Someone was reading it. I had it on the shelf, and someone moved it and read it without asking me. I read it." Wyatt's voice came from the doorway. He had just come in from the barn, and he stopped inside the door and looked at Lillian steadily. "I finished the chores early. I picked it up off the shelf. I should have asked you first. I'm sorry." Lillian looked at him. The force of her look was a physical thing. "Those are my books," she said. "They were given to me." "They were," he said. "And I took one without asking." "That was wrong. I apologize." Lillian stopped. She had been prepared for an argument. Eliza could see it in her, the readiness, the gathered breath, the words already marshaled and waiting. She had been prepared for deflection or dismissal or the particular adult maneuver of making a child feel unreasonable for objecting to something unreasonable. She had not been prepared for a straight, immediate apology. "You're not going to tell me I'm being oversensitive?" she said. Her voice had changed, gone careful, probing. "No," Wyatt said. "You're not being oversensitive. I took something that belonged to you without asking. That's a straightforward wrong thing, and you called me on it, and you were right to." A long silence. Caleb had stopped eating. Rose had turned in her small chair by the window to watch. "You can finish it," Lillian said finally. "The book. You can borrow it when I'm done." "Thank you," Wyatt said. "I'll ask next time." "Yes," Lillian said, "you will." And she sat down and went back to her breakfast with the air of someone who has conducted a necessary piece of business and is now prepared to move on. Eliza met Wyatt's eyes across the kitchen. He looked at her with an expression that was carefully neutral, though not because he was hiding something more, because he was being careful not to make more of the moment than it was. She looked back at him for 1 second. Then she looked down at her coffee. It was another 4 days before Lillian came to the barn voluntarily. She appeared there on a Tuesday afternoon, when Wyatt was doing something to the tack that involved a considerable amount of focused attention and leather conditioning oil. She appeared in the barn doorway and stood there for a while, and Wyatt did not look up, and eventually Lillian walked in and sat on a bale of hay 3 feet from where he was working. Silence. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Conditioning the leather. Keeps it from cracking in the cold. Does it work?" "If you do it often enough." She watched him for a while. "Can I help?" He handed her a cloth and showed her the slow and circular, working the oil into the grain. She did it carefully, the same way she did everything, with total concentration, getting it right. "Wyatt," she said after a few minutes. "Yeah. Did you know she was a widow when you put the advertisement in the paper?" He paused for just a fraction of a second. "She mentioned it in her letter." "Did it matter to you that she'd had a husband before?" "No. Why not?" He considered the question the way he considered everything without rushing it. "Because the question I asked myself was whether she was the person I said I was looking for in that advertisement. The rest of it is her life, not her flaw." Lillian rubbed the leather in slow circles. "Most people around here thought it was a flaw. I know." Martha Caldwell said. She stopped. "You don't have to tell me what she said." "She said no man with good sense would take on a widow with 3 children. She said it flat and even like reading a weather report." Wyatt looked at her directly. "Do I look like a man who's regretting this?" Lillian looked at him for a long moment. "No," she admitted. Then Martha Caldwell may have been wrong. Something crossed Lillian's face fast, almost imperceptible, the flicker of something that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. She went back to the leather. They worked in silence for another hour, and it was the most comfortable silence Eliza had ever seen her daughter sit in with a person who wasn't family. She watched it from just outside the barn door, where neither of them could see her. Then she walked back to the house and started supper and did not think about what was happening in her chest. Or rather, she thought about it, and then firmly set the thought aside and said to herself, "Not yet. Watch. Wait, you don't know enough yet." She was good at saying that. She had been saying it for 6 days. She kept saying it for another week. What changed things was not dramatic. It was not a single moment or a revelation. It was smaller than that, and more insidious, the way the actually important things usually are. It was the accumulation, the way Wyatt mended Caleb's boot without remarking on it, leaving them outside Caleb's door the next morning just fixed and ready. The way he had figured out, without being told, that Lillian preferred silence in the morning, and did not try to make conversation with her before she'd had an hour to settle into the day. The way he kept a cup of coffee ready when Eliza came down in the mornings, without making it a thing. It was simply there, the right temperature, because he had noticed when she came down and had gotten the timing right. She had not asked him to do that. He had not announced that he was doing it. It was simply done. She thought about that cup of coffee more than was probably reasonable. She thought about what it meant when a person noticed something about you and acted on it without requiring acknowledgement or credit. She thought about how different that was from the performed noticing she had encountered in the men who'd written back to her letters, the men who'd wanted her to know they were being patient, who their patience into a presentation. Wyatt's noticing came without a presentation. She was still thinking about it the morning Caleb got hurt. It was 3 weeks into their being at the ranch. Caleb had been climbing on the fence rails that bordered the horse pasture, which he did constantly, and which she had told him to stop constantly, and which he continued to do with the selective hearing of a 6-year-old, who understood the instruction, but judged the risk differently than his mother did. He fell badly. Not catastrophically, he was not seriously injured, but he fell from the top rail and hit the ground hard, and the sound of it came through the kitchen window where Eliza was working, and she was out the back door and across the yard, before she had fully processed what the sound was. Caleb was sitting in the dirt crying, and Wyatt was already crouching beside him, because Wyatt had been in the barn and was closer. "Let me see," Wyatt said, calm, steady, the voice of a man who was not panicking. He took Caleb's arm gently, looked at the wrist that Caleb was cradling. "Move your fingers for me." Caleb moved them. "Does it hurt here?" Caleb hissed. "Yes, bruised, not broken." He looked at the boy's face, at the tears, at the specific expression of a child who is crying more from shock and indignation than from real pain. "You had a fall." "I know I had a fall," Caleb said with feeling. "Hurts. Yes, you'll remember it next time you go up that high." Caleb considered this. "Probably," he admitted. Eliza reached them. She dropped to her knees beside Caleb and put both hands on his face, that automatic maternal gesture, checking the face first for damage and for shock, and Caleb leaned into her hands for a moment with the particular 6-year-old surrender of a boy who has decided it is acceptable to need his mother right now. "He's all right," Wyatt said quietly. "Wrist is bruised." "Nothing broken." She looked at her son's face, looked at his wrist. Her heart, which had been doing something irregular since she heard the sound from the window, began to slow. "Caleb," she said. "I know," Caleb said. "I know, Mama. You told me." And yet he agreed miserably. Wyatt's hand was on Caleb's shoulder, just resting there, not heavy, not making anything of it, simply there, the way a hand is there when a person needs to feel that someone is present. Caleb did not pull away from it. Eliza watched that. She watched her son lean slightly, barely perceptibly, into the touch. She picked Caleb up, because he was still small enough to be carried, and because she needed to carry him right now, and she took him inside and sat with him and put a cold cloth on his wrist and let him tell her, in complete and vivid detail, exactly what had happened from his perspective, which involved the wind and an unexpected slippage, and several other factors that he felt were relevant mitigating circumstances. She listened to all of it. After he'd been settled with his wooden horse and a piece of dried apple and the wrist wrapped and the drama sufficiently acknowledged, she went back outside. Wyatt was at the fence. He was fixing the rail that Caleb had fallen from, reinforcing it, she could see, adding a horizontal board below the top one that would make it harder to climb and harder to fall from. He did it without being asked. He did it without making a point of doing it. She stood in the yard and watched him work, and she thought, you cannot keep waiting to find the catch. Either there is no catch and you are wasting time being afraid of something that isn't there, or there is a catch and it will reveal itself eventually, and fear will not have prevented it. She walked to the fence. Wyatt, he looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for being there when he fell. For checking him over. He's a good boy," Wyatt said. "He is." She looked at the rail he was reinforcing. "You didn't have to do that, well," he said, with a tone that suggested the alternative had genuinely not occurred to him. "He's going to climb it again." She almost laughed. It surprised her, the almost law, the way it rose up through the tightness she'd been carrying, uninvited, real. "He absolutely is," she said. Wyatt's mouth moved. That thing again, not quite a smile. The thing before a smile. "Then it had better be safer when he does," he said. She stood beside him for a moment. The cold was sharp and the yard was quiet except for the sound of him working, and she stood there and breathed the Montana air and felt, with a kind of helpless clarity, that she was in danger. Not the kind of danger she had been afraid of, the other kind. The kind where someone turns out to be exactly what they appeared to be, and you run out of reasons not to trust them, and you realize that the thing you built all those walls against was not a threat but an opportunity. And the walls are still up, and you don't quite know how to take them down. She went back inside. That night, after the children were in bed, she came back to the kitchen for water and found Wyatt still at the table with Lillian's book, not her book now. He must have asked, because Lillian had finished it 2 days ago, and it had gone back to the shelf. He was 3/4 through it. He looked up when she came in. "Can't sleep," he said. "Just water." She went to the pump, filled a cup, drank it standing at the counter. "Is it good?" He looked at the book. She was right. I'd have to read it to understand why, but she's right. Lillian is usually right about books. She's usually right about most things, I'd guess. Eliza set her cup down, looked at him at her kitchen table, at his kitchen table. She corrected herself, though the distinction was beginning to feel different than it had 3 weeks ago. "Wyatt," she said. Yeah, she did not know how to say what she wanted to say. She had spent 3 weeks watching and measuring and maintaining the careful architecture of her own distance, and she still was not ready to say it directly. But she could say the outline of it. "I want you to know," she said, "that I see what you're doing, the things you do for the children. The things you do for all of us." She stopped. "I see it." He looked at her steadily. "I know you do," he said. She nodded, picked up her cup, set it in the basin. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Eliza." She went to the hallway. She stopped. "Wyatt," she didn't turn around. "The coffee in the mornings." "The way it's ready when I come down." A pause. He said. "Don't stop doing that," she said, and she went to bed. She lay in the dark and she thought about tomorrow, and about the week after, and about the particular shape of the life that was assembling itself around her, whether she had consented to it or not, and she thought about what it meant to stop bracing for the fall, and to let yourself be, for a moment, simply somewhere. She did not think it was love yet. She was not sure she would know love if she met it again. But she thought it might be the thing before love. The opening. The door that you'd kept shut so long you'd forgotten it had a handle. She was remembering the handle. In the room across the hall, she heard Rose shift in her sleep and make a small sound, the not quite word she made, when a dream was starting. It faded. The house settled into quiet. 3 weeks. She had been here 3 weeks. She looked at the ceiling in the dark and thought, Richard. I don't know what this is. I don't know where it goes. But the children are eating, and Caleb laughed today, real and full, the way he laughed before. And Rose has a chair she sits in like she belongs there. She breathed. I think we might be all right. She did not know, lying there in the Montana dark with the cold pressing against the window glass, that in 6 days a storm was coming that would test every single thing she thought she understood about Wyatt Holloway. She did not know that in 6 days she would watch him ride into freezing rain and not come back for 2 hours, and she would stand at that window, counting seconds the way she had once pressed her palm to a chest and counted to 10. She did not know that in 6 days she would understand, finally and completely, what kind of man she was dealing with. She only knew the ceiling, the quiet, the house, breathing around her like something alive. She closed her eyes and slept. The storm came on a Thursday. It did not announce itself the way storms sometimes do, with a slow darkening, a drop in the air, a gradual gathering of intention. It arrived the way the worst things arrive, fast, without warning, and with absolute conviction about its own authority. Eliza was in the kitchen when she heard the wind change. Not just pick up change in its fundamental character. From the cold but manageable Montana wind she had been learning to live alongside, to something that had weight and intent and was not interested in being navigated around. She went to the window and saw the sky had gone the color of a bruise, and the temperature had dropped. She could feel it through the glass, could feel the cold pushing in around the frame, and she thought, tonight is going to be bad. She had no idea. Wyatt came in from the barn at midday with his hat pulled low and snow already in the creases of his coat, and he went directly to the stove and put more wood in without stopping to take his coat off, which told her something about how seriously he was reading the sky. "How bad?" she asked. He straightened up. "I'm going to secure the barn doors and check the stock. I want the children inside before it gets any worse." "They're inside already. Caleb's been in since this morning." He looked at her. "Rose?" She was tired after breakfast. "Lillian?" A pause. "She's always reading." Something in his expression shifted just slightly, the thing she had come to recognize as his version of humor, the internal acknowledgement that went almost but not quite to the surface. "Then it was gone," he said. "Keep them in. This is going to come fast." He went back out. She watched him cross the yard through the window, bending into the wind, and she thought about what he had said about the storm and about fast, and she started doing what she always did when something was coming. She prepared. She checked the firewood stacked inside the back door. She put the kettle on. She assessed the pantry and started a pot of soup, because soup was the thing you made when the world outside was becoming unreliable. Because soup meant the stove was working, and the house was warm and you were feeding people, and those three facts together were something like a bulwark against whatever was outside trying to get in. Lillian appeared in the kitchen doorway at 2 in the afternoon with the particular expression she wore when she had been reading a book she was not quite ready to surface from and had surfaced anyway, because something felt different in the house. "What is it? Storm coming. How bad?" "Wyatt says bad enough." Lillian moved to the window and stood there for a moment. Then she turned and went back to her book. She appeared again 20 minutes later. "Do you need help with supper?" Eliza looked at her daughter, 9 years old, and offering to help with supper because she could tell her mother was doing the thing she did when she was managing something, the brisk, efficient, contained thing. "Set the table," she said. Lillian set the table. Caleb woke from a nap and found the storm and found it fascinating, which required a sustained maternal effort to redirect away from his stated intention of going outside to look at it more closely. Wyatt came back in at 4 with ice on his coat and took his hat off and stood by the stove for a full minute without speaking, which told Eliza more than any weather report could have. "I moved the stock in," he said. "They're settled." "Good. Temperatures dropping fast. Could be down to 20 below by midnight." 20 below. She had lived in Montana her whole life, and she still felt the number in her sternum. "We'll be all right inside," she said. "Yes." He looked at the soup pot. "Smells good." They ate supper early, while there was still some pale light left in the sky, because somehow they both arrived at this decision independently and then found themselves already executing it without having discussed it, which was one of those small moments that Eliza had been accumulating without knowing where to put them. The children ate fast and loud, and Caleb described, in comprehensive detail, what he believed a storm of this magnitude would feel like to a horse, which led to a discussion with Wyatt about how horses actually behave in storms that was genuinely educational for everyone at the table. Rose ate her soup and said nothing, which was normal. What was not normal was that when she finished, she did not take her doll and her cup and retreat to her chair by the window, the way she always did at the end of supper. She sat at the table. She sat there with her hands folded on the surface, looking at Wyatt with those enormous dark eyes, and then she pointed at the window. Everyone looked at her. "Loud," Rose said. It was at that point one of the longer things she had said since her father died. Nobody moved for a moment. "Yeah," Wyatt said quietly. Directly at her, not making more of it than the moment required. "It is loud. That's the wind." Rose looked at him. "Loud," she said again, but differently, not a report this time. More an inquiry. "It'll be loud for a while," he said, "but we're inside. We're warm." Rose considered this information with great seriousness. Then she picked up her doll, got down from her chair, and went to the window to watch the storm. Eliza looked at Wyatt. He was looking at his bowl. She looked back at her soup. She was thinking about the word we're warm. We're inside the we. Specifically, the casual, unthought way he had said it, like it was already true, like it had been true for a long time. She put her spoon down. She picked it back up. Storm hit full force around 8 o'clock. She knew because that was when the sound changed, when the wind went from something that was merely severe to something that was structural, that you felt in the walls and the floor, that made the whole house seem to breathe in and hold. The children were in bed, or supposed to be. Caleb was asleep. Lillian had her lamp still going. Rose started crying at 8:15. Not the general crying of a tired or unhappy child. The specific crying, the sound Eliza knew and feared, the sound that came from somewhere deeper than ordinary distress, the thin, high, spiraling sound that meant something was wrong with her body. Eliza was out of her chair before the cry finished. She hit Rose's door at a run and had her hand on her daughter's forehead in the same motion and felt the heat and felt her own heart stop. Fever. High, unmistakably high, the kind of heat that has no gradation, that announces itself the moment skin touches skin. Mama. Rose's voice was thin, the word barely there, and she was looking at Eliza with eyes that were too bright and too glassy and too aware at the same time. I'm here, Eliza gathered her up. I've got you. She carried her daughter out into the hallway and nearly walked straight into Wyatt, who was already there. He had heard the crying from the front room where he'd been banking the fire. He took one look at Rose in Eliza's arms and he did not ask a single unnecessary question. How high, he said. Her voice was steady. She was doing the thing, the controlled thing. She needs a doctor. The word landed between them and they both heard what it meant. The temperature outside was somewhere below zero. The storm was at full force. 12 miles to town. Wyatt turned and went to get his coat. Wyatt. Her voice stopped him. You cannot. I'll get Doc Harmon. He was already pulling on the heavy coat, the one with the wool lining, the one she'd watched him take off and put on 100 times in these past weeks and knew by the sound of. He's on Calloway Street. I know the road. It's 20 below. Maybe colder now. The road. I know the road, he said again. His voice was quiet and completely certain in the way that some voices get when a person has made a decision, and the decision is not available for amendment. He looked at her directly. Keep her warm, wet cloth on her neck if the fever climbs. Don't let her go to sleep until I'm back, Wyatt. Eliza. He stopped. He looked at her, at Rose against her shoulder, at the fever in the child's face, at Eliza's face. I'll be back. He was out the door before she could say anything else. She stood in the hallway and listened to the door close, and then listened to the storm close over the sound of his horse, and then she was alone in the house with tent, 3 children, and a fever, and 20 below. 0 outside and a man riding 12 miles into it. Lillian was in her doorway. Is Rosie, she said. Go back to bed, Lily. How sick? Eliza looked at her oldest daughter, at the child, who had been managing fear and information beyond her years for 2 years now, who had earned the right to the truth by never once falling apart when she received it. She's feverish, Eliza said. Wyatt's gone for the doctor. Lillian's eyes went to the window, to the dark and the storm and the nothing beyond the glass. He went out in that, she said. Yes, a silence. Oh, Lillian said, just that. And then, what do you need me to do? Get me the cloth from the kitchen and the cold water basin. Then go back to bed and stay there, so I know where you are. Lillian was already moving. Eliza took Rose to the front room where the fire was hottest and sat in the chair closest to the hearth and held her daughter against her chest and felt the fever burning through Rose's small body, and she did. What she always did in the moments of genuine crisis. She counted, not to 10 this time, just steadily, one number to the next. It was not prayer, and it was not thought, it was only the maintenance of control through the simple fact of sequence, of one thing following another, of time continuing to pass even when you were not sure you wanted it to. Lillian brought the cloth and the basin and went to bed without another word. Eliza pressed the wet cloth to Rose's neck. Rose whimpered. I know, Eliza said. I know, sweetheart doll, Rose said. Your doll is right here. Eliza tucked the rag doll against Rose's side. She's right here. Rose's hand closed around the doll. She did not sleep, which was what Wyatt had said, don't let her sleep, and Eliza kept her awake by talking to her, quietly and steadily, about anything that came to mind. About the horses, about what Caleb had said at breakfast. About the quilt she was going to mend when the weather broke. About the spring, which would come eventually, which always came, which had come every year of Eliza's life, without exception, including the years she had not been sure she wanted it to. Rose listened. Her eyes were glassy but open. The clock on the mantel read 8:40. Then 9. Then 9:15. The storm was everything, and Wyatt was inside it, and Eliza sat by the fire and held her daughter, and counted and told herself that he knew the road. At 9:40 she heard Caleb in his room, a small sound, the shuffle of a child waking in an unfamiliar storm, and she almost went to him, and then Rose made a sound that was closer to the thin, spiraling cry, and Eliza stayed. She had to choose. She chose Rose. She was still making that choice when the back door opened. Not the regular sound, the lifted and pushed sound she knew by now, the specific combination that meant the right person was at the back door. She heard it, and she was on her feet with Rose still in her arms before her mind had fully registered what her body already knew. Wyatt came in first. Behind him, stomping snow from his boots, was a smaller man with a bag, older, gray-bearded, with the brisk, impersonal manner of a man accustomed to being needed in the middle of the night, in the middle of storms. The doctor said, "Here." Eliza held Rose out. The doctor examined Rose with the fast, thorough competence of a man who had been doing this for 30 years. He checked the fever, checked her throat, her breathing, pressed gently on her abdomen. He asked Inga questions and she answered them in complete sentences. Because this was not the time to fall apart, this was the time to be accurate and clear and to give the doctor what he needed to help her daughter. Throughout all of it, she was aware of Wyatt. He stood by the door. He had not taken his coat off. He was still carrying the cold inside it, still carrying the storm, and his face had the red, wind-bitten look of a man who had ridden 12 miles in 20 below zero and not complained about a single foot of it. There was ice in his eyebrows. His hands, she saw, were shaking slightly, not from fear, from cold, from the kind of cold that gets into the muscles and stays there. He had not said a word since he came in. He was watching the doctor examine Rose. "Fever significant but not critical," the doctor said. "No infection in the throat. Lungs are clear. She's strong." He straightened and looked at Eliza. "Keep her warm. Fluids when she'll take them. Fever should break by morning if you're managing it right, and it looks to me like you are." He glanced at Wyatt. "Gave me about 2 minutes' notice before I'd have been asleep." Lucky, Wyatt said. The doctor looked at Rose one more time. Then he pulled a small bottle from his bag and handed it to Eliza. "If the fever climbs past where it is now, 2 drops in water. If it holds steady or drops, you're fine." "Thank you," Eliza said. The doctor left. The door closed. The storm took his retreating sound in about 4 seconds flat. The front room was quiet except for the fire and Rose's breathing and the wind and the clock. Eliza looked at Wyatt. He was still standing by the door. He had not moved in the last 10 minutes except to close it behind the doctor. She searched for the word. He looked like a man who had come back from somewhere and was still adjusting to the fact of walls and warmth, still occupying the transition between the storm he'd ridden through and the room he'd ridden back to. "Wyatt," her voice came out different than she intended. "Quieter." He looked at her. "Your hands are shaking," she said. He looked down at them, cold. "Sit down. I'm all right." "Sit down," she said, not harsh, not soft either, the voice she used when she meant something completely. "I need to put Rose down, and then I'm going to make coffee. And you are going to sit down and drink it." "Those are not optional things." He sat down. She settled Rose in the chair nearest the fire, tucked the quilt around her, with the doll pressed to her side, watched her daughter's chest rise and fall, steady and even. Then she went to the kitchen and started the coffee with hands that were entirely steady, and she stood at the stove and let herself feel, for exactly 30 seconds, the full force of what the last 2 hours had been. She counted to 30. Then she stopped feeling it and went back to managing it, because Rose was still feverish, and Wyatt was still cold, and the storm was still outside, and there would be time later, somewhere later, for the feeling. She brought the coffee back. He took the cup with both hands. She sat across from him. They were quiet for a moment, listening to the storm, listening to Rose breathe. "She's going to be all right," he said. "Yes." A pause. "The doctor said so." "I know what the doctor said." His voice was tired. Not defeated, tired in the specific way of a man who has pushed himself hard and is not quite all the way back yet. "I'm saying it because I need to say it." She looked at him. "Why?" she asked, quietly. He held the cup between his hands and looked at the fire, and the muscle in his jaw moved once. "My brother's name was Thomas," he said. She went very still. "He was 8 years old when he died." Wyatt's voice was flat, but flat the way water is flat when there's a great deal underneath it. "Fever, winter. Same kind of night." She said nothing. She had learned, over these weeks, that Wyatt Holloway was not a man who offered things about himself easily. When he offered something, it was because he had decided to, and the right response was to receive it, not to rush at it. "The doctor couldn't get to us in time," he said. "Road was blocked." "My mother sat with him the whole night." He paused. "I was 10. I sat with her. We watched it happen." "The fire crackled. That's why you rode out," she said. "I wasn't going to let a child get sicker in there while I sat inside waiting for the weather to change." He looked up at her then. "Not ever. Not for any reason." She looked at him across the front room of his house, their house. That word again, the "we" from earlier tonight, and she thought about a 10-year-old boy, sitting beside his mother in the cold, watching something terrible happen slowly. And then about a 38-year-old man riding 12 miles into 20 below zero, so that thing did not happen again, not in a house he was responsible for, not to a child who was in his care. She thought, this is who he is, not who he is presenting himself to be. Not who he wants her to think he is, this is the actual man. "Wyatt," she said. "Yeah, I'm glad you're back." He looked at her steadily, not with relief, not with any particular expression she could name easily, with something quieter and more serious than any of that. "Me too," he said. Rose made a small sound from the chair and they both looked at her. She was shifting, the doll still pressed to her chest, moving the way children move when a fever is doing something, when it's climbing or breaking or simply rearranging itself. Eliza crossed to her immediately and put her hand on her forehead. Cooler, not cool, not better yet, but measurably, perceptibly cooler than it had been 20 minutes ago. "It's coming down," she said. She heard Wyatt exhale. Not dramatically, just exhale. The breath that leaves a body when it has been holding against something and the something has shifted. She stayed beside Rose for a long time, checking the fever in intervals, replacing the cool cloth, talking to her daughter in the low continuous voice she'd been using all night. Wyatt stayed in the room. He did not try to make himself useful in ways that weren't needed. He did not sleep, though she could tell the cold and the ride and the hours were in him. He simply stayed. At some point past midnight, Rose's fever broke. Eliza felt the sheet of heat lift off her daughter's skin, felt the transition from burning to merely warm to the damp, settling calm of a fever that has run its course and surrendered. Rose's breathing changed at the same moment, deepened, lost the shallow, rapid quality it had had all evening, and Rose made a sound that was almost a word, or was a word. The syllable at the beginning of her name for her doll, and then she was asleep. Really asleep, the safe kind. Eliza pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead. She stood up. She turned around. Wyatt was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before, and could not fully read, except that it was open in a way that his face was not usually open, that it was the face of someone who has stopped managing what they're showing. "She's all right," Eliza said. "I can see that," he said. She stood there in the middle of the front room, with the fire behind her and the storm outside, and her daughter breathing safe in the chair, and she felt something come loose inside her that had been fastened down for a very long time. When she cried, Eliza said, "Tonight, when I felt her forehead," she stopped. "You didn't fall apart," he said. "You never do." "I do," she said. "I just do it later, when nobody's watching." He looked at her. "I saw you," he said, "at the train station. The first minute when you stepped off the train, before you put the face on." She did not ask what face. She knew what face. The face that said, I can manage this. I have managed harder things. There is nothing here I cannot manage. What did you see? She said. A woman who was terrified, he said. And who was going to get off that train anyway? She held herself very still. That's why, he said. Quiet, direct, that's why I wrote what I wrote. That's why I came to the station. Because I'd been looking for someone a long time, and the woman who wrote me those letters was the most honest person who'd done it. Not the most cheerful, not the easiest, the most honest. I wasn't trying to be honest, she said. I was trying to survive. I know, he said. That's what honest looks like most of the time. She looked at him. The clock said nearly 1 in the morning. The storm was still going outside, full and heavy and uninterested in them. And inside the house her daughter was sleeping with a broken fever, and her son was asleep with his wooden horse, and her older daughter was in her room with her books, and there was a man sitting across from her who had ridden 12 miles in 20. Below zero because he couldn't sit still inside while a child needed a doctor. Wyatt, she said. Yeah, I need to ask you something. She looked at him directly. And I need you to answer me straight. All right. Are you? She stopped. Began again. Are you doing this because it's the right thing to do? Because you said you'd do it, and you're the kind of man who does what he says. He was quiet for a moment. That's part of it, he said. What's the rest of it? He looked at her with the open face, the one she didn't see very often, the one he kept behind the quiet and the competence and the everyday patience that she had been watching for 6 weeks. The rest of it, he said slowly, is that I come inside at the end of every day and there's noise in this house. Not chaos, just the sound of people in it. Of children and meals and Caleb talking about horses and Lillian arguing with her books. He paused. I didn't know how quiet it was before. I didn't know I'd gotten used to the quiet. I know now, she breathed. And she said, and when Rose called your name tonight, your name specifically, not just, but Mama, I was already at the door. He looked at her steadily. I don't think I decided to go. I was just going. She pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. Not because she was going to cry. Because she needed to hold the feeling inside long enough to know what it was before it left. She knew what it was. This is going to be complicated, she said. I know that. I have 3 children who've already lost one person they loved. I know that too. And if she stopped, if we and then it doesn't work. Eliza, his voice was gentle and utterly certain in equal measure. I know what you're afraid of, and I am not going to tell you it's nothing. Because it's not nothing, it's the most important thing. He leaned forward slightly. But I am going to tell you that I am not leaving. Not because of difficulty, not because it gets hard. I've been watching your family for 6 weeks, and I have not found a single thing that makes me want to leave. I've found things that make me want to stay more. She looked at him. Like what? She said. Like Caleb with the horses. He said it simply. Like Lillian deciding to lend me her book. Like Rose sitting in that chair on the porch the first day, like she'd always been there. He looked at her directly. Like you, Eliza. The way you are in this house. The way this house is different with you in it. She was quiet for a long moment. The fire, the sleeping child. The storm. I have not let, she started, I know. I have been watching for the catch, for the thing that would explain it. I know you have. I haven't found it, she admitted. No, he said, you haven't. She sat with that. Then she stood up and went to check on Rose one more time, the forehead, the breathing, the doll still pressed to her chest, and everything was as it should be. The fever gone and the child sleeping and the night almost over. She turned back. Wyatt, she said. Yeah, in the morning. She stopped. When it's morning and the storm has passed and it's light again, and everything is ordinary again. I'm not going to pretend this conversation didn't happen. I just need you to know that. He looked at her. Neither am I, he said. She nodded. Good night, she said. Good night, he said. Eliza. She went down the hall. She stopped at Caleb's door and opened it a crack and found him asleep and fine and with the wooden horse still in the curve of his arm. She closed it again. She stopped at Lillian's door and found the lamp dark and her daughter's breathing even and the book on the floor beside the bed where it had fallen when she fell asleep. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed. She thought about what Wyatt had said about his brother Thomas. She thought about a 10-year-old boy watching something terrible happen slowly and being unable to stop it. And then about a 38-year-old man who had carried that memory for 28 years and responded to it not by closing himself off from loss, which would have been the reasonable thing, the self-protective thing, but by refusing to let it happen again. By riding into the storm, by being the person who showed up. She thought, I have been waiting to find out who you are. She thought, I think I just found out. Outside, the storm was beginning very slightly, very tentatively to ease. She could hear the difference in it, the way the wind had lost just a fraction of its worst register, the way the house had stopped bracing quite so hard. It was not over, but the worst of it was behind them. She lay down. She looked at the ceiling. She thought, Richard, I loved you. I love you still. And I think the children are going to be all right. She breathed. I think I might be learning how to be all right too. She did not know, lying there in the settling dark, that 6 days from now, everything she thought she understood about this situation was going to be tested in a completely different way. She did not know about the man who was going to ride out from Red Willow with papers in his coat and a claim he believed was legal, and a look on his face that said he had decided. Eliza Whittaker did not deserve what she had found. She only knew the ceiling going lighter at the edges as the storm very slowly, very reluctantly began to release them. She closed her eyes and let the quiet hold her. 6 days after the storm, a man rode up the drive. Eliza heard the horse first, not Wyatt's horses. She knew their sounds now, knew the particular cadence of each of the 5 animals in that barn the way you learn the footsteps of people in your house. This was a different horse. A stranger's horse, and the sound of it brought her to the window before she had consciously decided to go there. The man who dismounted was not someone she recognized. He was perhaps 50, thick in the chest, wearing a coat that was better than the weather required. And he carried himself with the particular posture of a man who has decided in advance that he is going to win whatever conversation he is about to have. He had papers in his hand. She could see them from the window, folded, official-looking, the kind of papers that do not travel 12 miles in winter for social purposes. Her stomach dropped. She did not know why yet. She knew before she knew. Wyatt was in the barn. She heard the man knock, and she went to the door, and she opened it, and the man looked at her with an expression that was polished and courteous on the surface, and something underneath it that was neither. Ma'am, he touched his hat. I'm looking for Wyatt Holloway. He's in the barn, she said. I'd appreciate that. He smiled. Name's Gerald Voss. I'm a land agent out of Helena. She looked at the papers in his hand. I'll get him, she said. She went to the barn and she said, Wyatt, there's a man at the door. Name is Gerald Voss. Wyatt went very still for exactly 1 second. Then he set down what he was holding and came out of the barn, and she watched his face as he walked, and his face told her that the name Gerald Voss was not unknown to him, and that its arrival here was not a good thing. Go inside with the children, he said. Wyatt, please. He looked at her directly. I'll explain everything. Go inside. She went inside. She did not go far inside. She stayed close enough to the front window to hear voices through the glass, not words. Not clearly, but the shape of the conversation, the tone of it. She heard Voss's voice, which was smooth and measured, and had the quality of a man making a presentation he has made before. She heard Wyatt's voice, which was the voice she knew, quiet, even, giving nothing away. Then Voss's voice rose, just slightly, just enough. And then Wyatt's voice rose to meet it. She had not heard Wyatt raise his voice before. She moved away from the window when she heard Lillian behind her. Julian said. A man from Helena, Eliza said. Go finish your reading. Lillian did not.
What does he want?
I don't know yet. She kept her voice even, Lillian. Go read. Lillian looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that missed nothing, and then she went back to her room, and Eliza heard her door close, and she turned back to the window. Outside, the 2 men were still talking. Voss held out the papers. Wyatt did not take them. Eliza pressed her fingers against the glass without meaning to, and then pulled them back. 5 minutes later, Wyatt came inside. He came in through the back door, lifted and pushed, and he was moving the way he moved when he was managing something. When the thing he was managing was difficult enough to show in the tightness around his jaw and the set of his shoulders, even though nothing else showed it. He sat down at the kitchen table. Eliza sat across from him. "Tell me," she said. He looked at her. "Before I tell you, I need you to know that I intended to tell you this. Not today, not like this, but before things went any further between us. I was going to tell you." Her heart did something complicated. "Tell me what?" He put his hands flat on the table. "The ranch has a debt on it, a land loan taken out 8 years ago when I was trying to expand the operation. I've been paying it down steady for the last 6 years. I'm not in default. I have never been in default." His jaw tightened. "But Gerald Voss represents a land-holding company out of Helena that bought the original loan 2 years ago, and they have been looking for a technical breach, a legal reason, to call the note early. They found one." She stared at him. "What kind of reason?" "The original loan agreement had a clause." He said it like a man saying something he has looked at from every angle and still cannot make sit right. "A morality clause, common in loans of the period. It states that the property can be forfeited if the holder engages in conduct." That he stopped. "That brings disrepute or moral irregularity to the property." Eliza looked at him. She felt the understanding arrive before the words did. "Me," she said. "You. An unmarried woman living in the house of an unmarried man. That's what Voss is claiming. That our arrangement constitutes a breach." The air went out of the room. She sat with it for a moment. Just sat with the shape of it, the extraordinary, infuriating, completely predictable shape of it. A man with a company behind him and papers in his hand, riding 12 miles through post-storm cold, not to discuss anything real, not to address anything true, but to use the fact of her existence in this house as a legal lever. "He's going to try to take the ranch," she said. "He's going to try." "On the grounds that I'm here." "Yes," she breathed. "How long has he been working toward this?" "Voss's company has been watching the property for 2 years, waiting for something they could use. According to him, my advertisement in the paper and the subsequent arrival." He said the word with controlled precision. "Gave them what they needed. The advertisement." She almost laughed. Not from humor, from the specific bitterness of it. "They used the advertisement." "Yes," she looked at him. "What are your options?" "2. He held up one finger. "I can contest it legally. It'll take time. It'll take money. And it depends on finding a lawyer willing to argue that a widow and her children staying in a man's house does not constitute moral irregularity," which he paused. "Which is not an easy argument, given the clause and given how courts in this territory tend to read these things." "And the second option?" He looked at her directly. "We get married," he said. The word sat between them on the table. Not a romantic word right now, a legal word, a practical word. The word as solution, as defense, as the removal of the argument before Voss could finish making it. She looked at him. "When?" she said. "He's given me 30 days to remedy the breach or vacate." His voice was very careful. "I want you to understand that I am not telling you this to pressure you. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the situation completely and make whatever decision is right for you." "You already want to marry me," she said. It was not a question. She was not asking, she was naming the thing that had been building since the conversation in the storm, since the night he'd ridden for the doctor, since the morning she'd told him not to stop with the coffee. He held her gaze. "Yes, but you don't want me to marry you because of this." "No, clear and immediate. I want you to marry me because I want to marry you. The fact that it also solves a legal problem is coincidental and unwelcome." She looked at her hands on the table. She thought about 30 days. She thought about what 30 days would look like, packing the children again, finding somewhere to go that was nowhere specific. Going back to what she'd been before without even the cold comfort of pride, because she'd have tried this and it would have failed. And she would have proof that everything Martha Caldwell said was. She stopped that thought. She stopped it hard. I need to think, she said. Take whatever time you need. I need 24 hours. He nodded. She stood up. She went to the window and looked at the yard, and at Gerald Voss, who was still out there, still standing by his horse, looking at the property with the proprietary assessment of a man who has decided it already belongs to him, and she felt something move through her that was colder and cleaner than fear. Actual clarifying bone-deep anger, not at Wyatt. Not at the situation, not at the cruel randomness of it. At Voss, specifically at the type of man Voss was, the type who looked at a widow and 3 children and saw not people but a mechanism. A legal lever, a useful vulnerability. She had dealt with that type before. She had dealt with Thomas Caldwell's quiet complicity and Martha's loud certainty and the 8 men who had stopped writing when they learned she had children, and she had dealt with all of it by surviving it, which was the only tool she'd had. She had a different tool now. Wyatt, she said, still at the window. Yeah, does Voss know about the children? A pause. He mentioned them. What did he say about them? He said. Wyatt's voice tightened. He said that the presence of another man's children in the household was a further complication. She turned around. She looked at Wyatt sitting at her kitchen table, his kitchen table, their kitchen table. That word again. And she looked at the man who had ridden 12 miles in 20 below zero, and who had made a chair for a 3-year-old, and who had apologized to a 9-year-old for borrowing a book without asking, and she made a decision. She made it the way she made all real decisions, not slowly. Not carefully, not after extensive deliberation, but at the moment the thing became clear. It became clear. I'm not leaving, she said. He looked up at her. I need to think about the how, she said, about what it means and what we tell the children, and what we owe each other when this is done. I need 24 hours to think about all of that. She looked at him steadily. But I am telling you right now that I am not letting a man with papers in his hand make this decision for me. Not him, not Martha Caldwell, not any of them. Wyatt's hands on the table unclenched slowly. Eliza, he said. I need the 24 hours, she said. That part stands, all right. She went to find Lillian. Lillian was in her room with the door closed, and the book open and her eyes tracking but not reading. Which meant she had been listening as hard as she could through the wall and absorbing what she could make out and filling in the rest with inference. Eliza sat on the edge of her daughter's bed. Lillian put the book down. Tell me, Lillian said, 'cause she was 9 and she was Lillian and she was not interested in being managed. So Eliza told her, not the full legal complexity, but the shape of it, the man from Helena, the papers, the threat to the ranch, the choice that was in front of them. Lillian listened with her hands folded and her face entirely still. When Eliza finished, Lillian was quiet for a moment. He didn't know about the debt when we came, she said. He knew about the debt. He didn't know they'd use us as the reason to call it. But we're the reason. We're the pretext, Eliza said. That's different. Lillian thought about this distinction. What are you going to do? I'm going to think tonight. And tomorrow, I'm going to tell you what I've decided. Are we going to have to leave? Eliza looked at her daughter. At the child who had learned at 9 that adults could not always be trusted to protect you, who had arrived at this ranch braced for disappointment, who had borrowed a book and started to unclench, who had sat in that barn doing tack work in companionable silence and experienced what it felt like to be in the presence of an adult who didn't need her to perform anything. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I want you to know something. What? Whatever happens, we're not leaving because we were unwanted. I need you to understand that. If we leave, it is because of a legal mechanism being used by a man who has no interest in us as people. Not because nobody wanted us here. Lillian looked at her. He wanted us here, she said. Not a question, Eliza said. He did. Lillian picked up her book. She opened it. Then she stopped and looked up, Mama. Yes, I want to stay, she said. Flat and simple and entirely sincere. I know that's not the only thing that matters. But I want you to know. Eliza pressed her lips together for a moment. I know, she said. I'll be back in the morning. She checked on Caleb, who had not heard anything, and was entirely occupied with a project involving the wooden horse and some string that he was not fully willing to explain, and she checked on Rose, who was fully recovered from the fever, and was sitting in her porch chair despite the cold, wrapped in a quilt, watching the horses in the far pasture with the focused attention of a child who has decided animals are more interesting than people, and is not yet wrong about this. She stood on the porch beside her youngest daughter. "Rose," she said. Rose looked up at her. "Do you like it here?" Eliza asked. Rose considered this question with the gravity she applied to most things. "Horses," she said. "Yes," Eliza agreed. "There are horses here." Rose looked back at the pasture. "Stay," she said. One word, clear and certain, the way she said the things she said infrequent, and therefore waited. Eliza sat in the cold beside her daughter for a while. Then she went back inside. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark, and she thought about Richard, about what Richard would have thought about all of this, about what he would have said about Wyatt Holloway specifically, and she thought that Richard, who had been a man of considered judgment and little vanity, would have looked at Wyatt Holloway and nodded, once, slowly, and that would have been enough. She thought about what marriage meant to her now, at 36. With 3 children, and the knowledge of what it felt like to be married and then not married, and how different those two states of being actually were in the lived daily fabric of a life. She thought about the cup of coffee in the morning. She thought about the wooden horse on the porch rail. She thought about a man riding 12 miles in 20 below zero and coming back with ice in his eyebrows and not a single word about it. She thought about the fact that Wyatt Holloway had told her about his brother. She had not missed the significance of that. She knew what it cost him. She knew because she recognized it, the specific cost of opening something you have kept sealed for a long time, the way it felt going out, and the way it felt after. The particular vulnerability of having offered something true about yourself, and not yet knowing if it will be received or dropped. She had received it. She thought about that for a long time. At some point before dawn, she arrived at the thing she'd been circling all night, the thing underneath all the other considerations. She was not afraid of marrying Wyatt Holloway. She was afraid of wanting to marry him. There was a difference, and it was important. She had arrived at this ranch prepared to be practical. Prepared to enter into an arrangement that was honest about what it was, 2 people building a workable life, together with clear eyes and reasonable expectations. She had been very careful not to want anything more than that. She had guarded against wanting anything more than that, the way you guard a wound attentively, constantly, because you know that if it doesn't heal right, you'll be feeling it for years. But somewhere between the coffee in the morning and the night in the storm, the wound had healed, and she hadn't been paying attention. And now she was lying in the dark at 36 years old, with 3 sleeping children, and a man across the hall who had told her he wasn't leaving, and she wanted to marry him, and that was terrifying and clarifying and very, very real. She sat up. She got dressed in the dark. She went to the kitchen and built up the fire and started the coffee, because it was her turn. She was standing at the stove when she heard the specific sound of Wyatt's door. Wyatt's footsteps, the Wyatt-shaped way the house communicated his movements through its boards and beams. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her. She turned around. She handed him the cup she had poured. He took it without speaking, and she saw him understand, in the way that he understood things quickly and without requiring explanation, that she had made her coffee for him this morning, and that this was its own kind of answer. He waited. "I'll marry you," she said, "not because of Voss. Because I want to. Those are different things, and I need you to hear that they're different." He held the cup in both hands. "I hear it, and I need you to know." She stopped. "I need you to know that this is not a thing I can do lightly. Not again. I can't do this and then have it not." She stopped again. "I know that," he said. "Do you, Eliza?" His voice was quiet and certain. "I have been alone in this house for 10 years. I did not put an advertisement in a paper because I wanted company. I put it in because I had decided I was ready to stop being alone, and when I was ready, I wanted to do it right." He looked at her steadily. "I am not asking you to trust me because it's convenient. I'm asking you to trust me because I mean to earn it. Every day, for as long as you'll let me." She looked at him. 30 days is not very long, she said. No, he agreed. We'll need to go to town, to the magistrate.
Yes.
The children will need to know before we go. Yes. And Voss, I'll send a message to Voss today. He'll have the marriage certificate before his deadline. Something moved in Wyatt's expression, not triumph, not satisfaction, something quieter and more considered. This doesn't solve everything. They'll be talking Red Willow. There are people who'll say we did it for the property. Let them say it, Eliza said. He looked at her. Let them say whatever they want to say, she said. I spent 2 years caring what people said, and it got me nothing except hungry children and a very thorough education in how little other people's opinions actually feed anybody. She met his eyes directly. I know why I'm doing this. You know why you're doing this. That's sufficient. The first thing that crossed his face then was the thing before the smile. Then it became the actual smile. She had not seen him fully smile before, not like this, not unguarded, not the whole of it. It changed his face, made him look younger and less careful, and entirely real, in a way that hit her somewhere in the chest with a force she had not prepared for. She looked away first. I'll tell the children after breakfast, she said. All right. She started breakfast. He set down his cup and came to help, and they moved around the kitchen together in the particular choreography they had developed over weeks, without discussing it, each occupying the space the other didn't. Each knowing without asking what needed doing and doing it. She thought, this is already a marriage. The paperwork is just the paperwork. Caleb took the news about the way Caleb took most news, by immediately locating the part that was most directly relevant to him. Does that mean Wyatt's my? He stopped. Does that mean I can call you? He stopped again, looking at Wyatt with enormous, uncertain eyes. You can call me whatever you want, Wyatt said. There's no wrong answer. Caleb thought about this with extraordinary seriousness. Not Pa, he said, Pa. But maybe, he thought. Maybe Wyatt is fine. Wyatt is fine, Wyatt said. Caleb nodded, satisfied, and returned his attention to his breakfast. Then he looked up. Can I still go in the barn? You could always go in the barn, Wyatt said. I know, Caleb said. I just wanted to make sure the barn situation wasn't changing. Rose said nothing. She looked at her mother, and she looked at Wyatt, and she looked at her doll, and then she climbed down from her chair and walked across the kitchen to where Wyatt was sitting, and she stood beside his chair and looked up at him. He looked down at her. She put her hand on his arm. Just her small hand flat against his sleeve, no words. No explanation. Then she climbed back into her chair. Eliza pressed her lips together very hard. Wyatt looked at his plate and was quiet for a moment, and then he picked up his fork and ate his breakfast, and she could see, from where she was sitting, that his jaw was working in the specific way it worked when he was holding something inside, that he was not going to let out at the breakfast table with children present. She understood that completely. Lillian waited until after the meal. She waited until Caleb had gone to the barn, and Rose was in her chair with her doll, and Eliza was cleaning up, and then she came and stood in the kitchen doorway where Wyatt was pulling on his coat to go out. Wyatt, she said. He looked at her. I need to tell you something, she said. All right. She straightened her shoulders. 9 years old, standing in a doorway with the particular bearing of someone who has decided to say a hard thing and is not going to let the difficulty stop her. When we came here, she said, I didn't trust you. I thought you were pretending. I thought there was something underneath that was different from what you were showing. He waited. There wasn't, she said. I was wrong. And I want you to know that I know I was wrong. He looked at her for a moment. You were right to check, he said. She blinked. What? You were right to check. You've got a mother and a brother and a sister who depend on you to notice things. Trusting too fast would have been the mistake, not the other way around. Lillian stared at him. Then you're a strange man. I've been told that. I mean it as a compliment, she said. I'd take it as one. Went back to her room. The door closed. Eliza stood at the counter with her hands in the dishwater and did not turn around until she was reasonably certain her face was doing what she wanted it to do. They went to town 4 days later. The magistrate was a man named Harold Pruitt, who had the efficient manner of someone who performed civil ceremonies regularly, and understood that the parties involved generally found the paperwork more meaningful than the performance. He asked the necessary questions, and they gave the necessary answers, and it was done in under 20 minutes. And then they were standing outside the magistrate's office in the cold, and Eliza was wearing a ring that had been Wyatt's mother's, and that he had produced from his coat pocket that morning with the quiet air of someone who has been waiting for the right moment and has decided this is it. She looked at the ring on her hand. She thought about the chain of hands it had been on. She thought about what it meant to be the next hand. "All right," Wyatt asked. "Yes," she said. They drove back to the ranch. Halfway there, Wyatt said, "Voss will get the certificate by the end of the week." "Good. He won't be happy. He can be as unhappy as he likes," she said. At a distance, he glanced at her sideways. "You're not what I expected." She looked at him. "What did you expect?" "Someone more," he considered. "Uncertain, given what you'd come through." "I was uncertain," she said. "I just did the things anyway." He looked back at the road. "That's the bravest kind of certain there is," he said. She looked at the ring on her hand. She thought about the morning. She had pressed her palm against Richard's chest and counted to 10, and then about the train platform and the word home, and about Rose's hand flat against Wyatt's sleeve at the breakfast table, and about all the mornings of coffee, and all the nights of the fire, and the particular quality of a house that has people in it who are choosing to be there. She thought, we were here all along. We just needed someone to open the door. The ranch came into view. The children were outside, she could see them. Caleb near the barn, Rose on the porch in her chair, Lillian sitting on the porch rail with her book. And as the wagon came through the gate, Caleb looked up, and then he was running toward them, and Rose was climbing down from her chair, and even Lillian was putting the book down. "How'd it go?" Caleb shouted, running beside the wagon. "Fine," Wyatt said. "Are you married?" Caleb processed this. "Does that change the barn situation?" Caleb, Eliza said. "I just need to know," Caleb said reasonably. "The barn situation is unchanged," Wyatt said. Caleb nodded, satisfied, and ran back to the barn. Wyatt stopped the wagon and helped Eliza down, and she felt the ring on her hand as she took his, and she stood in the yard of the ranch that was theirs now, the word complete and simple and without qualification, and she looked at the house. Then she felt something small and warm press against her side. Rose. Rose had come off the porch and come to stand against her mother's hip, the doll in one arm and the other arm around Eliza's leg, and she was looking up at Wyatt with those serious dark eyes. Wyatt crouched down to her level. Rose looked at him. Then she said clear as water, home, one word, but the right one. Wyatt looked at the little girl for a moment with his open face. The one Eliza had learned was the real one. The one behind the quiet and the competence. The one that came out when he had stopped managing what he was showing. "Yeah," he said. "Home." He looked at Eliza. She did not look away this time. The certificate reached Gerald Voss on a Friday. Eliza knew because Wyatt told her, matter-of-factly, the way he told her things that were resolved clean, without drama. The door closed and the subject finished. Voss had no legal ground left. The morality clause had no purchase on a married couple operating their own property. Whatever the land company out of Helena had been planning, it was done. She thought she would feel relief. She felt something more complicated than relief. She felt the specific settling that comes when you have been braced against a thing for so long that when the thing finally stops, the bracing itself takes a while to catch up. Her body had been carrying the tension of Voss and the 30 days and the papers and the threat, and now the threat was gone, and her body didn't quite believe it yet. And she found herself standing in the kitchen 3 days after Wyatt told her, and still waiting for the next thing to go wrong. The next thing did not go wrong. What happened instead was spring. Not the calendrical spring, it was still February, still cold, still Montana in the way that Montana in February insists on being. But something in the house changed. Something in the daily rhythm of the ranch changed. The particular quality of the tension that had been underneath everything, the held breath, the waiting released, and what replaced it was something she did not immediately have a word for. She found the word eventually: ordinary. The days became ordinary, and ordinary was extraordinary to her because she had not had ordinary in 2 years. She had had survival and management, and the constant low hum of impending disaster. Ordinary was new. Ordinary was Caleb at the barn every morning, and Lillian reading at every available opportunity, and Rose in her chair by the window, and Wyatt at the table with his coffee, and herself at the stove. And all of it happening without crisis, without the ground shifting underneath. She kept waiting for herself to find it insufficient. She didn't. The first time Red Willow came to them was in March. Not Voss was done, retreated back to Helena to find some other mechanism to deploy against some other property. What came to them in March was something she had not anticipated, which was the town itself, in the particular way that small towns reckon with things they have been wrong about. It started with Sarah Hennessy. Sarah Hennessy was perhaps 60, stout, forthright, and the closest thing Red Willow had to a conscience that occasionally operated correctly. She had known Wyatt for years, known of Eliza for the duration of the gossip that had circulated around the advertisement and the arrival. And she appeared on the ranch one morning in March with a jar of preserved peaches and the air of a woman who has decided to do something and is not going to waste time about it. Eliza answered the door. Sarah looked at her. "I'm Sarah Hennessy," she said. "I came to apologize." Eliza stood in the doorway. "For what?" "For not coming sooner." She held out the peaches. "May I come in?" She came in. She sat at the kitchen table, and she looked at the house, at the evidence of children in it, at Caleb's drawings now pinned beside Wyatt's old ones, at Rose's chair pulled up to the table, at Lillian's books stacked with territorial precision on their shelf, and she said, without being asked, "I heard what Martha Caldwell said in the general store. I was in the back. I didn't say anything. I should have." Eliza poured coffee. "Martha believes what she said," Eliza told her. "She wasn't wrong that people thought it." "No," Sarah said. "But being what everyone thinks isn't the same as being right." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "A woman who raises 3 children alone after losing a husband is not a burden. She is exactly what this territory is built on." "I should have said that." "I didn't. I'm saying it now." Eliza looked at her. "The peaches are very much appreciated," she said. Sarah Hennessy laughed, a real one, surprised out of her. "You're a plain-spoken woman." "I've had to be." Sarah set down her cup. "You're going to need to be. There are people in Red Willow who are not going to come around the way I'm coming around. People who've decided you did this for the property, or that Wyatt lost his senses, or that having another man's children in a household is something other than simply having children in a household." She looked at Eliza steadily. "I want you to know that those people are not everyone, and that the ones who feel that way will feel it less loudly once they see how things actually are." "And how are things actually?" Eliza said. Sarah looked around the kitchen again. "They look," she said carefully, "like a family." The word landed quietly. After Sarah left, Eliza stood at the window for a while. She heard Caleb in the barn, his voice, bright and carrying, explaining something to the bay mare with characteristic thoroughness. She heard Lillian's footsteps in the hall, the creak of her room door. She heard the back door lifted and pushed, and Wyatt's boots on the kitchen floor. "Who was that?" he said. "Sarah Hennessy. What'd she want?" "To apologize, and to bring peaches." She turned from the window. "She said there are people in town who think I married you for the ranch." Wyatt poured himself coffee. "What'd you say?" "I said the peaches were appreciated." He looked at her with the thing that came before the smile. "Good answer," he said. "Wyatt." She looked at him directly. "Does it bother you, what people say?" He considered this the way he considered everything fully, without rushing it. "About 3 years ago," he said, "I had a bad stretch with the cattle. Lost 8 head to sickness. People in town said I was careless, said I hadn't managed my stock right. Said a man alone couldn't run a place this size." He set down his cup. "I knew what I had done and what I hadn't done. People said things that weren't true, and I couldn't make them stop saying them, so I stopped listening." He looked at her. What's true about us is true regardless of what's said about it." She held his gaze, she said. She had not said it before. She had known it had been knowing it, in the accumulating way, since sometime around the coffee, and the storm and the open face in the firelight, but she had not said it. Because she was Eliza Whittaker, and she did not say things before she was sure of them, and she was sure of it now, standing in the kitchen on a March morning, with the sound of her son's voice in the barn, and her husband's coffee on the stove. Wyatt looked at her. He put down the cup. He crossed the kitchen, and he stood in front of her, and he put his hand against her face, careful, deliberate, the way he did everything, and he said, "I have been in love with you since the first letter." She blinked. The first letter you wrote me. The one where you told me you had 3 children, and you were not going to apologize for it." He looked at her steadily. "Nobody writes like that, unless they mean everything they're saying. I read it and I thought, this is the most honest person who has ever written to me. And I thought I would very much like to know her." She looked at him. "You could have said that at the station," she said. "You weren't ready to hear it at the station." She thought about the station. About the way she had stepped off the train braced for disappointment and found a man taking off his hat. About the word home and the way it had moved through her before she could stop it. "No," she said, "I wasn't." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then Caleb's voice came from the barn at a volume that suggested something of significant interest had occurred, and they both turned toward the window, and Wyatt said, "I'd better go see what that is," and she said, "Yes." "You'd better." And he went out through the back door, lifted and pushed, and she stood in the kitchen and pressed her fingers briefly against her own cheek where his hand had been, and then turned back to her work. Because the biscuits were not going to make themselves. She was smiling. She noticed she was smiling and did not stop. What Caleb had found was a foal. One of the mares had delivered in the night, earlier than expected, and the foal was on her feet and uncertain about the fact of her own legs. And Caleb was beside himself with a joy so total, it was almost structural. He looked like a child who had been built specifically for this moment and had been waiting his entire 6 years for it to arrive. Wyatt came in an hour later with the news and Caleb close behind him, and Rose heard the word baby horse and came off her chair at a speed that was uncharacteristic for a child who generally moved through the world with enormous deliberation. She went to the barn and stood at the stall with her doll in one arm and the other arm hooked over the rail and watched the foal with an expression of such pure, uncomplicated wonder that Eliza had to look away. Lillian came out of her room. She had been in there all morning with the door closed and the particular quality of closed door that meant she was working through something, not a book today. Eliza had noticed. Just herself and the room and whatever was happening in that 9-year-old head. She stood beside Eliza at the stall rail. They watched the foal together. "Mama," Lillian said, "I wrote Papa a letter this morning." Eliza went still. "I know he can't get it," Lillian said, with the flat directness she used when she was saying hard things. "I know that's not how it works. I just needed to tell him things." A pause. "About here, about what happened, about Wyatt." Eliza looked at her daughter. "What did you tell him?" she said quietly. Lillian kept her eyes on the foal. "I told him we were all right. I told him about the horse Wyatt carved in the books, and how Rose has a chair." She swallowed. "I told him that the man is a good man. I told him that I checked and he is." Eliza reached over and put her hand over Lillian's on the rail. Lillian let her. "I told him I didn't forget him," Lillian said. "I needed him to know that." "He knows," Eliza said. "You don't know that." "No," Eliza said, "but I believe it." Lillian was quiet for a moment. "Then is it wrong to be happy here?" When he stopped. "No," Eliza said, "it is not wrong. I need you to hear me say that clearly." "How do you know?" "Because your father loved you," Eliza said. "And people who love you don't want you to stay sad to prove it." Lillian pressed her lips together. The foal took 3 uncertain steps toward the rail. Rose made a sound of absolute delight that was closer to a word than anything else she had said, and Caleb said, "Easy, easy," in his most authoritative hoarse voice. And Wyatt put his hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder, in the way that meant you're doing it right, without saying anything. and Lillian watched all of it from the rail, with her hand under her mother's hand. And something in her face that was resolving, Eliza could see it resolving, the last of the held tension releasing. The 9-year-old becoming fractionally less ancient, and fractionally more simply 9. "Can I name her?" Caleb asked, meaning the foal. "You can propose a name," Wyatt said. "The mayor gets the final say." Caleb considered this arrangement perfectly reasonable. "Hope," he said. "I think her name should be Hope." Nobody said anything for a moment. Eliza looked at her son. "Hope," Wyatt said. "Because," Caleb said, with great seriousness, "we came here hoping, and then things were actually good, so it seems like the right name for a new thing." The barn was quiet. Rose said perfectly clearly, "Hope." And that was that. The thing with Martha Caldwell happened in April. Eliza had been expecting, it had known, in the way you know things when you understand people well enough, that Martha was not going to let this conclude without a final accounting. Martha was not a cruel woman. She was a certain woman, which was different, and certain women required their certainty to be addressed before they could release it. Martha came to the ranch on a Tuesday. Eliza saw her coming from the kitchen window and had a full 30 seconds to decide what to do with the feeling that arrived when she did. The feeling was not simple. It was not rage. She had moved past the specific rage of the general store, had set it down somewhere on the road between there and here. It was not nothing either. It was the complicated thing that lives between those 2 points, in the territory of people who have been wronged by someone who was not entirely wrong about the situation, only wrong about what the situation meant. She opened the door before Martha knocked. Martha stood on the porch. She looked at Eliza. She looked at the house behind her, at the evidence of it, the specific way a house looks when it is lived in, by people who are managing and not just surviving. "Martha." A silence. "May I come in?" Martha said. She came in. She sat at the table. She did not take the chair with easy authority the way she had sat in Thomas Caldwell's store. She sat in it, the way people sit in chairs when they are not certain of their welcome and know it. Eliza poured coffee. She set it in front of Martha without ceremony. Martha wrapped her hands around the cup. "I said things," Martha said. "In the store. That days," Eliza said. "The children heard." "Yes." Martha looked at her cup. "I was not wrong that men in this territory tend to see a widow with children as a difficulty. I was not wrong about the practical realities of what you were facing." She looked up. "But I was wrong about what those realities meant. About what they said about you." She paused, "and about what was possible." Eliza looked at her cousin. She thought about the store. About the words carrying full length of the room. About Lillian's jaw setting. About Caleb pressing close to her side. About the specific damage that certain true enough things do when they're said in front of children as verdicts. "You told my children," Eliza said, "that nobody would want them." Martha flinched. "I told you." "You told me in front of them," Eliza said. "They heard, and Lillian especially, she carried that. She came here ready to be confirmed in what you'd said. She was 9 years old, and she was already braced for rejection, because someone she was supposed to trust had told her it was coming. She kept her voice even. I need you to understand the weight of that." Martha was quiet for a long moment. "I understand it," she said. "I am not. I don't have a way to undo it." "I know that." "No," Eliza agreed, "you don't." Another silence. "Is there—" Martha stopped. "Is there anything I can do? Going forward? Is there anything that would be different than you were?" Eliza said. "That's all. The next woman you see in a hard situation be different than you were with me." She looked at her cousin steadily. "That's worth something. Not to me, not about this. But in general, it's worth something." Martha nodded. She finished her coffee. She stood to leave. At the door she stopped and looked back at Eliza, and something in her face was different from any expression Eliza had seen on her before, stripped of the certainty, of the efficient delivery of practical truths. Stripped down to something underneath that was more human and more sorry. "The children," she said. They're good," Eliza said. "They're very good." Martha nodded once. She left. Eliza stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her go, and then she turned back to her work. And she thought, "That's done." not fixed, not made right, but done. And there was a difference, and the difference was enough. What she had not expected was Lillian. Lillian had been in her room during the visit, had known Martha was there, had heard the voices. She appeared in the kitchen doorway when Martha's horse had cleared the gate, and she looked at her mother with a question in her face that she didn't put into words. She came to say she was wrong, Eliza said. Lillian thought about this. Did it help? She asked. Eliza considered the honest answer. Some, she said, not all the way, but some, Lillian nodded. Some is something, Eliza agreed. Lillian went back to her room. 10 minutes later, she came back out, carrying the letter she had written to her father in March, the one she had written and not sent, because there was nowhere to send it. She set it on the kitchen table. Will you read it with me? She asked. Eliza sat down. They read it together, Lillian's careful, serious handwriting, the words of a 9-year-old girl telling her dead father the things she needed him to know. About the ranch, about the foal named Hope, about the books on the shelf. About the man who had apologized for borrowing one without asking. He is not like you, Lillian had written. He is not you. But I think he is good. I think he is the kind of person you would have liked. I think you would have shaken his hand. Eliza read that twice. She folded the letter carefully when they finished and handed it back to Lillian. He would have, she said. He absolutely would have. Lillian took the letter. She folded it again and held it against her chest for a moment. Then she said, okay, with the particular finality of a child who has finished something important. And she went back to her room. Eliza stayed at the table. The summer came. With it came the work that summer always brings on a cattle ranch, the long days, the constant labor, the particular satisfaction of work that is immediately connected to its own result. Wyatt worked harder than she had understood a single person could work, and she worked alongside him, and the children worked in the ways children work, which is to say incompletely and enthusiastically, and in ways that sometimes created more work than they resolved, and it was good. It was genuinely, deeply, unreservedly good. Caleb could handle the horses by midsummer in ways that made Wyatt stop what he was doing and watch with an expression of pure, uncomplicated pride that he did not bother to contain. The bay mare trusted Caleb with a totality that Wyatt had never seen in an animal of her particular temperament, and he told Caleb this. And Caleb received the information with the precise mix of humility and satisfaction that is the ideal response to a real compliment about a real skill. I told you she'd think I was fine, Caleb said. You did, Wyatt agreed. I didn't say the finest thing she'd ever seen. That was Mama. Your mama is usually right. Caleb considered this. Most things he allowed. No, Wyatt said. Nobody's right about everything. Caleb seemed reassured by this democratic distribution of fallibility. Rose talked more. Not constantly, Rose would never be Caleb, would never fill every available space with words, but steadily, purposefully, the way someone talks when they have decided the world is safe enough to speak into. She named the foal Hope every morning when she went to the barn, as if confirming the name was still operative. She told Eliza things about the horse's specific things, observed things, the commentary of a child who has been watching long enough to see patterns. She said Wyatt's name, regularly, easily, the way you say the name of someone who belongs in your daily life. The day it changed was a day in late July. Rose had been in the barn with Wyatt, which was becoming commonplace. She went where the horses were. And the horses were often where Wyatt was, and she had stopped requiring her mother's proximity in the barn the way she had for the first months. Eliza was in the kitchen, and she heard them through the open window, Wyatt's voice, low and patient, and Rose's voice, higher and intermittent, and then a silence, and then Rose's voice again, saying something Eliza couldn't make out. Then Rose appeared in the kitchen doorway. She walked to Eliza. She stood in front of her mother and looked up at her with great seriousness. Mama, she said, I asked Wyatt if I could call him Papa. Eliza's hands went still on the counter. What did he say? She asked. He said to ask you, Rose said. Eliza looked at her daughter. 3 years old, carrying her doll, with a question in her face that was so clear and so direct and so completely uncomplicated by the weight of everything that had come before it, the grief, the moving, the adjusting, the slow, painstaking work of trusting someone new, as if she had simply arrived at an answer and wanted to confirm it with the relevant parties. "What do you want to call him?" Eliza said. "Papa," Rose said. Simply. "Then that's what you call him," Eliza said. Rose turned around and went back to the barn. Eliza heard her small footsteps crossing the yard. Then she heard, through the open window, Rose's voice, "Papa." Just the word. And then Wyatt's voice, altered in some way she could hear even from the kitchen, not broken, not overwhelmed, just altered in the specific way a voice alters when something inside the person speaking has moved. "Yeah," he said. "Hope's hungry," Rose informed him. "Let's get her fed then," he said. Eliza pressed both hands flat against the counter and looked at the ceiling for a moment and breathed through it, through the feeling that was too big to have a name. That was the sum of everything that had happened, and everything that had been survived, and everything that had been found on the other side of the surviving. She breathed through it. Then she started supper. That night, after the children were in bed, Caleb, with his horse and his plans and his absolute certainty about tomorrow, Rose curled around her doll with the ease of a child who sleeps well because she feels safe. Lillian, with her book and her serious face going soft at the edges the way it did only in sleep, Eliza and Wyatt sat on the porch. Not talking. They did that sometimes, sat together in the Montana, quiet with the darkness all around and the stars overhead and nothing between them that needed to be said. Because the things that needed to be said had been said, and the things that didn't need to be said didn't need to be. After a while, Wyatt said, "Rose called me Papa today." "I know," Eliza said. "I wasn't ready for it, no." He was quiet for a moment. "My brother Thomas never had children." "Never got the chance," he paused. "I think about that sometimes. What he would have been like with them." She looked at him. "I think," she said slowly, "that people who are lost make room for the people who come after. Not because they're replaced, because love doesn't close when someone leaves. It stays open." She paused. "Richard left room. Thomas left room. The room doesn't go empty just because they're gone." He looked at her. "How do you know that?" he said. Quiet. "Because Rose called you Papa," she said, "and she didn't stop loving her father to do it." He held that. She watched him hold it. Then he looked out at the darkness and the stars in the Montana night that went on in every direction without asking anything of anyone, and he said, "I wasn't going to advertise in that paper." She looked at him. "What changed your mind? A night in February 3 years ago. Storm like the one we had this winter. I came in from the barn and the house was so quiet." He shook his head slightly. "Not peaceful, just empty. There's a difference. I sat at the table and I thought, this is not what I want the rest of my life to look like. So the next morning I went to town and I bought a copy of the Helena paper and I wrote the advertisement." He looked at her. "I sent 4 before anyone wrote back worth writing to." "I was the 5th? You were the 5th." She thought about that. About 5 advertisements, and the particular persistence of a man who had sat in an empty house in a February storm and decided to do something about it. "I almost didn't write," she said. "I read the advertisement 10 times before I let myself believe it meant what it said." "What made you write?" "Lillian," she said. "I thought if I don't try this, I have to explain to Lillian someday why I didn't try. And I couldn't think of an answer that was worth giving her." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Your daughter terrifies me sometimes," he said. "She terrifies most people in the best way, in the absolute best way," Eliza agreed. They sat. The night held them. Somewhere in the barn, Hope made a small sound, the sound of a foal settling, and then it was quiet again. "Wyatt," she said. "Yeah, we're going to be all right." He looked at her. Not with relief. She had learned that Wyatt did not express things through relief, had never been a man who let himself fully feel things through the negative. He expressed them through the positive, through what was present rather than what had been feared. He looked at her the way he had looked at her at the train station, when he'd said the word home directly, steadily, with his whole attention, nothing held back. "We already are," he said. She looked at the ring on her hand. She thought about everything that had led to this porch, this night, this man beside her. The farmhouse in the Red Willow Cold, the tin box with the important papers. The train platform and the wooden horse on the porch rail, and the fever that broke before dawn, and the papers in Voss's hand that had come to nothing, and Martha's voice in the general store, carrying full length of the room, confident and certain and wrong. No decent man will choose a widow with 3 children. She thought about Rose's small hand on Wyatt's sleeve at the breakfast table. She thought about Lillian in the barn, with the tack oil, and the question she had asked, and the answer she'd received, and the single syllable "oh" that had been her daughter's verdict. She thought about Caleb naming the full hope because "we came here hoping," and then things were actually good. She thought about herself at the kitchen counter saying "I love you" for the first time, out loud, to a man who had told her he'd loved her since the first letter. The first letter. She had written it in a fury of desperation and honesty, not intending it to be anything other than practical. She had not known, writing it, that it was the most important thing she would ever put on paper. She had not known that it would travel across Montana and land in the hands of a man sitting alone in a house that was too quiet, and that he would read it and recognize something in it that she had not even recognized in herself. She had not known, and it had happened anyway. That was the thing about good things, she thought. They did not wait for you to be ready. They arrived when they arrived, and you either opened the door or you didn't. And she had opened the door, and this was what was on the other side. This house, these children sleeping safe, this man. This life ordinary and real and entirely, completely hers. She had never been a woman who needed to be rescued. She had only ever needed someone willing to stand in the door and say, "There is room here. Come in. You were not too much. You were never too much. You were exactly what I was looking for, and I am not leaving, and this is home." She had found that. She had built that. The 3 children who everyone said made her unworthy of love had become the proof that she was worthy of exactly this specific, particular, irreplaceable life. And on a porch in Montana with the stars going all the way to the edge of the world, and her husband beside her and her children sleeping inside, Eliza Holloway looked out at the darkness and felt, with a certainty she did not need to qualify or question or hold at arm's length any longer, that she had always deserved this. Every last ordinary, extraordinary, hard-won inch of it. They had not been unwanted. They had simply been waiting for a man who could see the whole of them, the grief and the stubbornness and the 3 children and the worn dress and the first letter, written in desperation, and call it not a burden, but a gift. He had called it a gift, and he had been right.